Thank you for the heads up. Thank you for letting me know. So as we keep talking about like, oh, you know, the large intestine is all about moving turbid substances out of the body. It's like our mechanism for removal of waste. It's our garbage man of the body. But when we look at the channel, it's also like large intestine 11 is one of the main points we're going to use for clearing heat in the body. Large intestine 4 we're going to use for chi stagnation pretty much anywhere. So we get this disconnect between channel function, where you're learning points and what they do, and the organ function. So I want to look at, I'm going to ask you guys to play along with me in the chat a little bit here. I'm going to open up the stomach patterns from last week. You should be able to see that now. And I just want to go through a couple of these and talk about how this would relate to channels just a little bit. I recognize you guys are still in the early stages of learning channels, so I don't want to go too in depth here because that just wouldn't be helpful. But I want to talk about this a little bit. So with stomach chi deficiency, hopefully I've given you guys a feeling for what this would look like, what the stomach organ looks like when it has a problem. If we're talking about what the stomach channel looks like, often that's a blockage in the channel resulting in either excess or deficiency on one or the other side of the blockage. You can get direct invasion of pathogens into the channel, like cold, but in general, it just tends to be blockage. So like I broke my leg this past year. I've got an area that's still, my leg is pretty functional now, but I've got an area on the stomach channel that's swollen up towards the knee, and then the channel is a little bit, the muscle in the channel is extra weak below this blockage, and it's something I'm still working to clear. Get the blockage in the area earlier on in the channel will tend to fill up, and the area afterwards will tend to be smaller. So when it comes to channel problems, we're treating that directly, and which channel it is doesn't matter a ton. But when it comes to the organ problems, well, we can't treat the organs directly with acupuncture. We do treat them directly with herbs. But when we're treating the organs, we're still treating them through the channels. So when we look at stomach chi deficiency, or really when we look at any organ chi deficiency, one of the things we're going to be asking is how would we go about getting more chi to that organ to fix it? If we're looking at it from an herbal perspective, and we see something like heart chi deficiency, we're going to look for an herb that tonifies heart chi, right? It's very like, if heart chi deficiency, then herb that tonifies heart chi. Sometimes it's more complicated, but that's the basics of it. When it comes to acupuncture, well, the acupuncture doesn't create chi out of nothing. The needle itself doesn't generate blood on its own. It needs things to work with. So when we say heart chi deficiency, one of the first points we might use is stomach 36. With stomach being the grandfather of all the organs, the first organ involved in digestion, if we have a deficiency anywhere, we're often going to start with stomach 36 just as a way of saying to the body, hey, why aren't you making more of this substance? Let's make more of it. And then we're going to use other points to tell it where to direct. So stomach 36, produce more. We combine that with points like heart 7, one source point on the heart channel, then we're giving the body a very basic message that says, produce more of what the heart needs. Produce more, send it to the heart. We're going to combine that with other points to make sure that those directions are more thoroughly given. So oftentimes things like heart blood deficiency are going to end up getting treated mostly through other channels unrelated to the actual organ. That makes some sense? In theory. I don't want to make this too complicated, but I don't want to leave you guys thinking that just because these organs have very specific functions, that that's necessarily what their channels do. Often the channels do quite more because they're in a relationship. But just as, you know, when we're talking about the stomach organ here, we're talking about, I want to make sure that you guys understand why we'd have an uncomfortable feeling in the epigastrium when you have stomach chi deficiency and why you would have a lack of appetite. At the same time, as you continue your education, I recommend checking in and asking yourself, do I understand why this point performs this function? Do I understand why we'd be using urinary bladder points for anxiety attacks due to heat in the heart? Sorts of things. So just, we're going to expect to see some different things out of the channels and out of the organs. And as you continue your education, make sure you're checking in to make sure you understand why you're using points when you're using them. Make sense? Okay.
Peter?
Yeah.
It seems like you are sounding a little bit muffled. I don't know if it's just me or if it's...
Is that a general consensus, or is that just, let's see.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time.
Yeah.
This should be all the same equipment. Is that any better?
Better.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, that's my headphones picking up the fact that I have a fan on me because it's very hot. I hope you guys are okay watching me slowly sweating close to that. All right. Please let me know if that comes back. I'll try to just talk a little bit louder as well. Okay. So I just want to mention that briefly. Does anyone have any questions from last week, from the last couple of weeks? Just a quick reminder, we're going to be having a quiz at the end of the second break next week, and we're going to go over that quiz, and then we're going to review for the final. Do all that together. After class today, I'm sending out pretty much every quiz I have, just so you guys can look over them. They're not for credit. You don't have to send them to me. But they're for you to look over. The quiz next week will be for extra credit. It'll be for a decently substantial amount of extra credit. I haven't quite decided what I can get away with yet. That's something like 5% of your total grade. Since now we just have a midterm and a final and an extra credit quiz, normally there'd be small amounts of extra credit attached to everything throughout the semester. Normally I'm gonna like give 110 on everything and grade it out of 100. But that doesn't work super great this semester.
Peter,
so,
can I ask a question? So next class, the quiz is going to be sort of like a practice final, you said? And how long do you allot time-wise from the class to the quiz?
I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes for the quiz.
Oh, 20 minutes. Okay, and what else?
It's going to be multiple choice, straightforward stuff.
Okay, and what else are we covering for this week and next week?
So this week, we're wrapping up all of the young organs, and then we only have one more week of class. And in theory, I would like to cover Shanghanlun, Wenbing, possession, Gu syndrome. That's not going to happen. That's too much stuff. So I'm not sure yet. I would really like to cover possession because you guys aren't going to get it anywhere else, except in a clinic, or if you take 5-element classes. And I think it's an interesting way to investigate how Eastern and Western medicine talk about the same thing in very different language, because that's what a lot of lectures about. So I think we're going to cover possession and maybe Shanghanlun. I'm going to have to take the Shanghanlun slides and see if I can take out about 30%, and we should be able to cover those two things. But the majority of the final will just be the yin and the yang organs that we've covered over the past couple of weeks in this week. Nicole, you looked into Gu syndrome? Find anything interesting?
It was like a real sincere rabbit hole. We were asked to kind of like in my class to give like pretend cases of people we know, like our husbands, and they're like 12-year stomach issues. So one of the interns suggested that it might be Gu syndrome. It's super, super interesting. So I've read, it's funny, it's the same author that you gave us all the organ stuff for.
Heiner Fruhoff.
Yeah, so I read so much of his stuff. I'm like, I can't wait to hear you talk about it. I was thinking about it, like I think Peter said this the other day that he was going to talk about it, so I'm pumped that you're going to do it. So
great. Yeah, it's an interesting subject, and it's I keep this short. Most of what we're going to talk about in this class, most of what we have talked about, most of what you're going to learn in school is inside the TCM box. But I want to make sure you guys are aware of things that are outside the TCM box, because there's a lot of very effective low-hanging fruit outside of the TCM box. And both the 5-element concepts of possession and Gu syndrome are examples of that. And they're both places where TCM doesn't have a whole lot to offer, and Western medicine doesn't have a whole lot to offer. And it's all the same underlying theory as we talked about in this class. It still gets back to invasions of pathogens, organs, channels, similar systems. Any other questions or comments? Questions back to channels may be oversimple, but would you say the channels work more with the organs interrelationships and moving chi. Well, yeah, so when you guys learn the channel pathways, you guys learn about how the channels go internally, and connect to organs and do all this stuff. So like when we say that like the lungs have a relation, the rhythmic motion of the lungs affects the ability of the large intestines to defecate. Well, that's in part because the lungs internally go down and connect to the large intestines, right? Like we have pathways that do this. Like the gallbladder comes up and passes through the back of the heart. That's how the secret spy function occurs. There's a way that those channels connect. So oftentimes when people are learning channels, it's like, oh, the channels do this, but then when it comes to organ connections, it's all just kind of a fuzzy mess. But it's actually, you know, we have charted out exactly where these things connect and where that happens. So you're asking me, would I say the channels work more with, and then you give one statement. So this doesn't seem like a A or B question. It seems like a yes or no question. The channels are able to mediate the relationships between organs. The channels are able to move chi. The channels are able to kind of, you can think of it this way if we're talking, this body is a city. They're able to issue orders to the officials. So you could say to the liver, like, stand down the army for someone who's very stressed, if you're thinking within that paradigm, for example. That make sense, Danielle? If you got more to follow up, please go.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just thinking about using because you're saying using the stomach points to like help with heart chi deficiency.
Sure.
So I was thinking more like on that term. So.
Right, so I mean, the idea there is that if we look at how the organs function, the heart doesn't have the ability to generate its own chi. So if we use points that tonify the heart, like the Yuan source point, well, where does that tonification come from? It's not us going in and tonifying it like tuning a guitar or something. It doesn't work that way. Those resources have to come from somewhere, especially chi's a little fuzzy, but if we're talking about blood or yin, it has to come from somewhere. And as we covered last week, all chi comes from the stomach, kind of. And all blood comes from the stomach, is the grand thought. So if we're looking at, it's similar to saying like, oh, if I want a package delivered from Amazon to my house, I just click the button that says deliver to my house. But really I'm setting in motion a whole chain of events that involve a ton of things in between. So when we use a point that says tonify heart chi, like, yeah, well, we got to make sure that when that point, when the Yuan source point goes to tonify the heart chi, that the resources are available. And to make sure that happens, we have to make sure the stomach's digesting. And then we have to talk to the patient about their diet. And that's part of how the holistic aspect of this comes together, right? So it's not like, if heart chi deficiency, then Yuan source point. It's if heart chi deficiency and a good diet and a functional stomach, then look for blockages, look for reasons it's not happening. If the stomach isn't working and their diet is poor, then yeah, they're not generating it in the first place. And this might not really even be a heart issue. That makes sense? A little bit of a different way of thinking. Any other questions? You guys have good questions. All right, let's feel free to pause me at any time during the class today, but we're gonna go into one of my favorite organs, which is the gallbladder. That's stomach. One second, let's find the gallbladder. There we go. All right. So gallbladder statements of fact. We're doing same pattern here, right? Statements of fact, connections between organs, pathology, factors that influence it, and then individual patterns, right? So gallbladder statements of fact. The gallbladder stores and excretes bile. Bile is a pure substance within Chinese medicine. It's important, and that's probably the last you're ever going to hear about it. The gallbladder stores bile. The gallbladder controls decisiveness. So anytime, it's interesting, a lot of these ideas within Chinese medicine, like the gallbladder controlling decisiveness, we have correlates within English to these sorts of ideas. Like you could say that someone has a lot of gall, or that someone's action is very galling. These are both things that refer perhaps not to decisiveness, but something within the same region, like ability to go it alone, or ability to do something counter to what the majority is encouraging them to do. These are things that the gallbladder enables. If a person's gallbladder is particularly weak, then when confronted with a situation with a lot of social pressure, they will just go along with what's being said. For example, it's the gallbladder that says, yeah, I get that, but I'm going to go off on my own and grow in a different direction, which is a wood function, which is the gallbladder. Controls the sinews, so we're talking about contractile ability of the muscles, and we're talking about integrity of ligaments. So a person who has big muscles yet is surprisingly weak, we might be looking at a gallbladder issue. The gallbladder has within it and commands ministerial fire. We're not really going to touch the difference between imperial and ministerial fire in this class, but you should know these phrases. The gallbladder is the mansion of the central essence. Similar to these other things, the central essence, I've seen a little bit of debate about what this means. The consensus that I don't believe in is that they're talking about bile as the central essence, as bile is considered a pure substance. I think there's more to this, but yeah, you should know that phrase as well. And the 11 zong depend on the gallbladder. So we have the idea that the stomach is the elder of the 12 channels, of the 12 organs. And when we say 11 zong, they mean zong and fu here. But the 11 zong depend on the gallbladders because of this decisiveness, the ability to move forward, to make decisions, to make actions, which is necessary for the entire structure to work. This like moving from water to wood function, that's the yang aspect of wood, which is the gallbladder, which partially answers your question in a non-muscular way, Allison. The gallbladder's the yang aspect that starts this, the liver being the yin, kind of continues it. So the 11 zong depend on the gallbladder as a motive force behind everything else. So in terms of the difference in how the liver and gallbladder control the sinews, I wouldn't worry about it too much for now, because usually what you do when there's a sinew problem is you use both. There is a yin and yang relationship between the liver and the gallbladder, but wood itself is a quite yang phase, being yang within yin. So while the gallbladder is more yang than the liver is, they both have a relatively yang nature. So we can use them somewhat interchangeably, which is also a little bit of a cop-out on my part, because you can't hear very well again. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else going on in my computer that I can mess this up, because I'm not doing anything differently. Hopefully that's better. Hopefully that's better. Okay, well, thumbs up, I'll take that. Better now, great. Okay, so yeah, that's our statements of facts on the gallbladder. It seems fairly straightforward until you start thinking about the degree to which phrases like controls decisiveness matter. Like the gallbladder doesn't do a ton of things, but the things it does do are wildly important. So the gallbladder, just a couple of things from me. Well, I guess we'll do this with the next slide. So the gallbladder has this connection to the heart. The gallbladder provides courage and decisiveness to the mind. Matthew just got this whole thing about the mind being in the heart, which is not accurate at all. And the idea that the heart provides clarity integration so that decisiveness does not turn into recklessness, which is kind of true. That's more of a lung function, but we'll get into that. We're just going to spend a minute on Chinese medical psychology here. So the gallbladder is a number of different things. Excessive doubt can be a sign of gallbladder pathology. So some types of OCD of the like, did I turn off the oven? Did I? I know I did, but did I? That can be a gallbladder issue where the person isn't confident in things that they have good evidence for, that they themselves have done. Gallbladder can also be people's conscience, the voice in their head that tells them, maybe you shouldn't do that. That's often a gallbladder function. So people who tend towards recklessness and don't have angels on their shoulder, don't have a conscience inside of them, that's often a gallbladder related issue. One of the benefits that the lung brings to the body is the idea of propriety, of doing that which is correct. The gallbladder is not so much concerned with doing what is correct as it is in growing in the right direction. And the lung is more proper, a little more austere. So when they say provides clarity and integration so that decisiveness does not turn into recklessness, I would say that's more of a lung function of saying like, yes, but we also need to be correct. But when you're looking at people, you're going to see patients in the clinic with gallbladder pathology at the clinic at the school semi-frequently. They tend to have thick charts, but not be the people with thick charts who are also 70. They tend to be a little bit younger. And they tend to be the people who just need someone else to approve everything that they say, or disagree. They're the people who just need a sounding board because the ability to trust what they think is true just isn't present. So they come in and they say, you know, I've been thinking about maybe starting to eat healthier food. What do you think about that? It's like, yeah, well, what do you mean by healthier food? Let's talk about it. Happy to work with you, but also let's use some points to tonify your gallbladder because you should be able to answer this to some degree too. You guys know the type of psychology I'm talking about here? Sound familiar? Okay. So when someone is kind of a reasons not rules type of person, strong gallbladder function. Does it have a okay, let's start with Danielle's. Does it have any relationship to perfectionist? Perfectionist is going to be more metal. So gallbladder is going to be, an out of control gallbladder can often be someone who is a contrarian and a risk taker. Whereas a perfectionist tends to be someone with lung and large intestine issues who's obsessed with the concept. Because when you hear perfectionist, think purity, and that should lead you back to lungs, lead you back to metal. And the gallbladder is all about growth. So the person with too much wood energy is the sort of person who like can be very romantic, falls in love easily, but then falls out of love easily and doesn't look behind them. They're the sort of person who can be very charming, but leave a lot of destruction in their wake, for example. Nicole, so when someone is kind of like a reasons not rules, I'm not quite sure what that means. Someone
so,
who,
like you were saying, you brought up the moral compass idea, and I'm just trying to kind of differentiate in my head, like you're saying someone that like, it's kind of like if there's an idea by way of society saying it's bad if you do this, blah, blah, but then someone with gallbladder function that, which I guess it could kind of go pathological in that way too. That's like, well, I think that's stupid, so I'm going to kind of do it my way because this is what makes sense for me. So,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a relationship between healthy wood and healthy independence, for example. And excessive qualities within wood, especially within gallbladder, can lead to independence that borders on disdain for other people's perspectives and opinions, which is generally not a great way to go about doing things. So need for validation. Yeah, so it's not like low self-esteem and needing other people to help you with that. It's a need for validation that arises from an inability to trust yourself. So it's not like, oh, I'm stupid, I don't know. It's like, I don't know if I've looked at every perspective. Like, it's the opposite of independence. It's dependence on others for formation of ideas. So if we're talking about someone who's like, well, this is what the rules say, but screw the rules because I've thought this through. This is someone who goes, well, the rules say this, and I think I should follow the rules, but I should check in to make sure I understand the rules correctly. Is this how things are supposed to work? Because I just don't really know, and I don't want to do it wrong. And if this is a problem, like, I just want you to tell me that. And is that okay? It's more that sort of a thing, where it's like, let's get some more spine in you so that you can do what you already know to be correct. So Macchioccia breaks down decision-making into these 5 different organs, and I'd argue about details within this, but overall it's fairly accurate. So yeah, I completely, my understanding of the heart is just couldn't be much more different from Maciocia. The idea of mental clarity and integration happening there, I disagree. We talked about the small intestine separating the clear from the turbid, right? So discrimination within both a healthy idea of discrimination and an unhealthy conception of discrimination. Those are both small intestine things. So the person who's able to discriminate between the quality of street meat and going to a restaurant with an A rating, it's like, oh yes, that's intelligent discrimination. You can put things into categories of better and worse. And then you have unhealthy discrimination, which can also be a small intestine issue, which is where one of the places where you get, along with metal, a lot of the isms that we're currently fighting over today, sexism, racism, a lot of different types of bigotry become small intestine issues of discriminating improperly. The gallbladder's decisiveness, discernment. Yeah, I mean, either one works. I understand that discrimination is a loaded word and it's an uncomfortable word. But partially what we're talking about here is that it's both discernment and discrimination. So it's both the good and the bad sides of that coin. Because like a pathological small intestine or a pathological lung can switch from discernment to discrimination, let's say. Kidneys is going to be drive and willpower. So like, if you look at this picture and you take out any one piece, you can look at like, okay, I've got to make a decision about my lease is running up and I have to move. So I need to find a place to move. So that's going to be liver, capacity, and planning. And I need to use the small intestine to figure out whether or not it's a good place. Okay, I got 10 places. How do I rank them in terms of quality? That's going to be small intestine. And how do I get out of bed every day to go look at these places? That's kidney. And then how do I make the decision? That's gallbladder. So like, there was oh God, I can't believe I'm blanking on the actor's name. The guy who played Zoolander.
Ben Stiller.
Ben Stiller. There's a Ben Stiller movie that's not very good called Along Came Polly, in which he plays a risk analysis expert, like a claims adjuster. Maybe he's an actuary. And that entire movie is about someone who can do everything except use the gallbladder. So he can make the lists, all the pros and cons, and he can plan, and he's got plenty of drive, but he can't make decisions. And then that's contrasted with a female love interest who's mostly gallbladder, who's very decisive, but doesn't necessarily plan anything. And drama ensues. But you can see a lot of the psychology in common media as representing like, okay, well, let's take this decision-making process and then take a piece out, and then we've got drama. So at the end of the day, whether or not someone can sign a lease is a gallbladder function, for example. Okay, we got some questions here. Does the validation have to do any? Does the validation have anything to do with 11 zong depending on gallbladder? Like, could one of the zong be misfunctioning so the gallbladder can't be decisive? Yeah. The gallbladder being yang wood is in charge of decisiveness, but because everything's connected, if the gallbladder is weak and the person isn't decisive, we have to ask why that is. So an example that commonly shows up is that metal can over-control wood, right? So someone who's brought up in a household with very strict rules about what is proper and correct might have trouble trusting their intuition and their ability to be decisive, both of which are gallbladder functions, because what they perceive to be proper and the perhaps arbitrary rules that they've been brought up with might not go together. So you can get things like repression coming from the metal element that make the gallbladder not work well. And so me, in a way, is decision-making like the celestial cross. Everything is like the celestial cross, kind of. But I think this is just a little bit of a higher level way of looking at a process that occurs with inside the body where, like we say, decisiveness comes from the gallbladder, but if we say decision-making, we need to look at everything involved. So a patient comes in and their chief complaint is, but they might say they're afraid. And after talking to them for a little while, it turns out that what they are is incapable of making decisions. And there's a fear component. So then you might begin saying, okay, what are all the things that could contribute to decision making? And let's figure out where we can get some traction to work with it. Okay, that's a good sized rabbit hole for Chinese medicine psychology, but that's not what this class is. So let's keep going with gallbladder stuff. So general gallbladder pathology, it's a lot like the liver. The gallbladder and the liver overlap decently. So digestive problems, hypochondriac pain, a tendency to obesity. The main thing that we see as a difference here is the psycho-emotional aspect. And when you have a liver problem, you're often going to be using points on both the liver and the gallbladder anyways. So there's overlap in treatment as well. This is also one of those times where the Zong and the Fu are well connected. So oftentimes when we say like damp heat in the liver, we might actually be saying damp heat in the liver and gallbladder. And there might be a connection between those two things. So if a pathogen accumulates in one, it often bleeds over into the other. And then if we look at, say, the herbal treatments for it, there are plenty of herbs that treat damp heat in the liver gallbladder as a pair. And being a Fu, this tends towards excess. So there's not a whole lot of deficiency conditions within the gallbladder. When we talk about someone having a weak gallbladder, it's often more that it's an obstructed gallbladder. Not in the physiological sense, though maybe, but more in terms of pathogen accumulated within it. Jonathan, you have a question?
Yes, like about obesity. In the previous class, we learned that obesity would be a thing with Q deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So that's gonna create gaining weight. Why would be the gallbladder with obesity?
Similar to liver, this would be the gallbladder affecting the spleen and stomach.
But nothing got to do with the bile or this.
Not so much. I don't have a ton to say about the bile because it's never been something I've had to really investigate for a patient, and it's frankly not something you're really going to hear about in school much anymore. I mean, we use animal bile products in a clinical setting, herbal medicine wise. I mean, they're synthetic now because it's a terrible practice, but we see positive aspects to bile. You'll hear about it, but I don't think that's what the weight gain aspect about here is. There are gallbladder patterns that involve a damp heat in the gallbladder causing pain and oily stools, where that's a bile function, the bile not breaking down the fat. But I don't think that's obesity related. We have a lot of different ways to get to weight gain within Chinese medicine. It's not like, oh, the person has gained weight, we can make one herbal formula and sell it as a weight loss herbal formula, because there's 100 ways to begin gaining weight.
So mainly it's because wood overacting earth. And,
yes.
And another question, we mentioned a bitter taste in the mouth, that would be
yes.
liver. What would be a burning smell in the nose, smelling like burn? That would be
smelling burned things in the nose.
That would be more fire element.
I'd ask if their roommate was smoking. I would first look to environmental things. The nose is mostly going to be lung related, so I'd look to whether or not there's any damage in the lungs, like whether there's any fire cooking down the lungs. But the main thing I would be looking for is whether there's something within the environment causing that. Okay. So while Jonathan was asking about bile function in relation to obesity or weight gain, one thing we see here is that the gallbladder is an organ that tends to accumulate pathology with a heavy diet. So one of the things you'll hear, especially from more traditional Chinese practitioners in the clinic, is avoid all spicy, fatty foods. And a lot of that is gallbladder, well, it's digestive related, but a lot of that's gallbladder related, where the idea is that too much greasy, fatty foods tend to accumulate too much dampness within the gallbladder. And I like to pull this apart a little bit. So when we say don't eat too many fatty foods, we mean too much relative to what? We mean too much fatty food for the stomach to rot and ripen. So it's different for every person. It's not like this means 5 grams of fat for one person and 30 for another. It's dependent on that person's ability to break down fat. So in some ways, we see the actual function of the bile is related almost more to stomach function right? The job of breaking down fat is something we see manifested mostly in the stomach, despite bile being gallbladder related. And if you don't break down that fat, the gallbladder begins to become damp. And you see this in like the scalloping on the edges of the tongue tends to be dampness accumulating in spleen and stomach Q deficiency. But if there's puffiness right on the inside of the edge of the tongue, that's often gallbladder and liver related, and it's quite common. So same as the liver, the gallbladder is going to be affected by anger, frustration, bottled up resentment. I find the gallbladder is more affected by resentment than the liver is. There's something about, especially in the way that children are often raised, there are ways in which they need education, but often that education doesn't incorporate their ability to correctly tune their intuition and their ability to discern. And if that doesn't happen, then you can create timidity in the child. So a weak gallbladder will cause timidity. So kids who are often hiding behind their parents at an age that's like they're 10 and they're hiding behind their mother in public, like they're kind of at an age where we'd hope that wouldn't be happening. If you're seeing that kid clinically, you might be working on their gallbladder to help bring out more of their da-dan, their courage, their guts. So this is a da-dan, big gallbladder, is a phrase in Mandarin that means courage or guts. So they literally, you know, if someone's courageous, they must have a big gallbladder. Not in a pathological sense, hopefully, not in a like, take out their gallbladder sort of way. Danielle, on the flip side, does a low-fat vegan diet affect the gallbladder? Well, a lot of vegan diets are really high in fat, from what I've seen. So let's just say low-fat. Does a low-fat diet affect the gallbladder? Well, a low-fat diet's a good way to clear out a gallbladder that's got a lot of dampness, but we still need that yin, right? So fat in general is going to aid in generating yin within the body. So people who have things like stomach deficiency, tendency towards getting ulcers, a lot of heat in the stomach, often will make sure that they're eating fat, but the right sort of fat, not fat in the hot wings form. And we'll try to build their yin up with that. And Allison, it's, yeah, I mean, different fats are processed differently by different people. So often I see the kind of hierarchy of healthy fats having a bit to do with how easy those fats are for a person to process, digest, and incorporate into their system. So yeah, that healthy fat, it's true for both, but generally there's a lower dose of, it's going to take less. If you're eating coconut oil, you can eat more coconut oil before overwhelming your spleen and stomach than you can, say, bacon grease. Well, yeah. Or canola oil or a multisaturated trans fat. Seeing more veganism because of meat. Yeah, well, I mean, Chinese medicine likes meat. Real into meat. And meat doesn't have to be super fatty. Yeah. Okay. So the gallbladder is not particularly bothered by the outside climate, except for the fact that because the gallbladder tends towards getting heat pathogens, really hot climates, especially really hot and damp climates, as in New York these days, can be an issue for the gallbladder. And this is often when people start getting that irritable, like flash decision making sort of a thing. They're hot, they're sweaty, they're damp, and their gallbladder just makes decisions with no thinking through, and they regret those decisions because of the irritability, which is also a liver gallbladder thing due to the heat. But in general, external pathogenic factors don't affect the gallbladder a ton. We tend to adjust to these things. There's a big dietary factor. We're in prime watermelon weather right now. There are things you can do to help clear this out. We're talking pathology within the gallbladder. Dampness in the gallbladder looks a lot like dampness in the liver. So this is going to be dampness without heat or cold. You see jaundice. Now, when you think jaundice, you tend to think like kind of when you say jaundice to a Western medical practitioner, they tend to think of like a relatively neon yellow presentation, yellowing of the sclera. In this case, we mean what would be called like a subclinical level of jaundice. Like when we're looking at the sclera of someone's eyes, when we're looking at the whites of their eyes, if there's even just a little bit of yellow in there, that's worth noting for us. Like streaks of yellow in the eye. It's like, oh, there's a little bit of dampness in there. Maybe a little bit of heat, we can work with that. Whereas jaundice, that would not even register as jaundice within, that doesn't count. Nausea and vomiting. Yeah, remember this is just the dampness being obstructive to the middle jiao. It's made worse with fat. So if you have a patient that comes in and says, every time I eat a fatty meal, I get nauseated, one of the things we'll start working with is getting dampness out of the gallbladder. The cloudy urine is an interesting one. I'm not quite sure how to tie that into the gallbladder specifically, but rather when you get a lot of dampness accumulating in the middle and lower jiao, that turbidity can start to leak out through the urine, and you can have a cloudiness to the urine. This is also something I've heard reported from a number of, I used to live in California where pot is now legal, and I've got some friends in that industry, and I've heard a number of reports when talking clinically with practitioners who are in California that some heavy pot users report having cloudiness in their urine, which one of the effects of a lot of marijuana use is that it tends to cause dampness in the gallbladder and alters decision making. Lack of thirst, that's just the obstruction in the middle again. So the lack of thirst and dampness in the gallbladder is going to be the same as the lack of thirst and dampness in the stomach. It's just there's stuff in the way, so you're not thirsty. Sticky taste, dampness. Dull headache, dampness. Heaviness, fullness, distension, that's all dampness, and the hypochondriacal pain tells you where it is. That all make sense? Good. This should start to feel like a broken record a little bit. That's a sign that you're getting it. So hypochondriacal pain in this case actually means, so when we say hypochondriac, in the Western sense, we mean someone who always thinks they're getting sick, right? Who's like making up their diseases. When we're talking about anatomy and physiology, chondriacal or chondritis is the ribs, is the floating ribs especially. So when we're talking about costal chondritis, when we're talking about hypochondriac pain, we mean pain. When we say hypochondriac pain, we mean pain below the ribs. And in this case, mostly the floating ribs, which is where the liver is. So when we say, yeah, so this isn't made up pain, it's pain in a specific area. And my theory is that this comes from the fact that people who have this pain, traditionally, it often comes with emotion, and it's hard to, and there's no apparent source. So hypochondriac pain, a hypochondriac, someone who always thinks they might be getting sick, whether or not they are, may have hypochondriacal pain, which might be related to the stagnation of the liver that they have, which if nothing can be detected, then they're just making it up. That makes sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay. So we're taking dampness in the gallbladder and let's add heat to it to see how it changes. So you still have the pain below the ribs, fullness, distension, nausea, vomiting. The first part here is pretty much just all dampness, but the irritability is a little bit of heat too. And then here, instead of having cloudy urine, we're gonna have scanty and dark urine. Remember, the heat's cooking off the fluids. Before, the person had no thirst. Now they're thirsty, but they still don't want to drink. If this was just heat, they'd be thirsty and they'd drink. If it's just damp, they're not thirsty and they don't want to drink. If it's heat and dampness, then they're thirsty and they don't want to drink. And we can start to get some odd things here, like numbness of the limbs and alternating hot and cold sensations. And that's because we're starting to get more into a Xiaoyang pattern at this point, which we'll talk about a little bit next week if we do the Xiaoyang and stuff. And the last gallbladder pattern is gallbladder deficiency. So this is less common, but I've seen this pattern quite a few times in children and teenagers. So the nervousness and easily startled, The lack of courage and initiative, timidity, indecision. This is the person who walks into your office and you're sitting behind the table and you're ready to take their pulse and they kind of stand there looking uncomfortable and they're like, can I sit down? Is that okay? The chair is open, it's ready. The whole room is set up to invite you to sit. Yes, you're welcome to sit. But they're not going to do that until someone tells them it's okay. Sighing, a tendency to wake up early in the morning. So that's going to be usually after liver time, so like early. And restless dreams, because this deficiency is going to make the Hun move erratically as well. And that's your introduction to the gallbladder. How's that sound? Anyone have any questions? All right, let's take a break and come back at 2:15. I need a break too, so I'll be back in just a minute. All right, everyone, welcome back. You've got a minute to filter back in. Take your time. Anyone has any questions from the break, let me know.
I actually have a question.
Please.
So how would you, like, what would you do for the gallbladder? Like, would you tonify it or would you more drain it? I'm thinking more specifically for the deficient person. Like, what would you do for that?
So for the deficient person, you're going to be, you have to find some way to tonify the gallbladder. There might be things in the way. So the question becomes, why is it deficient, right? People can be congenitally deficient of the gallbladder. It can be something that's prenatal that we need to strengthen. You see this in kids who are timid from birth. You know, they're the kids who, they're the babies that cry at easy stimulus. They hide behind their parents the whole time. It often comes with a failure to thrive aspect. And so we might be working with the kidneys as well. But yeah, sometimes it's congenital. So you got to build them up from that standpoint. Sometimes it's a question of how they were raised. So like the repressive parenting that I mentioned earlier, maybe we're looking at lung overacting on, or metal overacting on wood, resulting in gallbladder deficiency. Sometimes, I think this is, so I mentioned that there aren't really external pathogenic factors that affect the gallbladder very much. This tends to be internal. So often it's coming from emotions, from belief structures, from how the person sees the world. And you need to begin addressing those things. We don't do that through talk therapy, we do that through acupuncture points. So oftentimes when I'm dealing with some, because I do a lot of Chinese medicine psychology, that's one of my favorite areas to work in. Oftentimes the way this works is you get into a conversation with the person and you help, and together you get to a point where they've got a real, where you've really scoped the problem, where you've really figured out what the issue that they want to work on that week is. And then you put in acupuncture points related to helping them get clarity on it. And then by the end of the treatment, things have changed. So you don't talk, you're not doing talk therapy, you're just helping them clarify the question. And then there are gallbladder points in the top of the head to help bring in clarity, urinary bladder points on the top of the head to bring in clarity, relieve constraint through other points. Gallbladder 13 and 15 are both great points and completely underutilized. Like Ben Shen is one of them, nourishing spirit. So like there are these points specifically for helping to bring in these qualities. So when you guys are learning acupuncture points at this stage, you're at the level of, we need to know what where the points are. There's going to be later stages where there are other questions about how to use points. And one of the ways to look at acupuncture points is through their names. The idea that the name is telling you what the point does. I gave you guys an excerpt from Dennis Wilmont's book about, I think it was large intestine 4 or something, a number of weeks back. It's like multiple pages on one point. That's true for every point. And I found that approach to work quite well within a psychological framework. So tonification, you start with the own source points. So gallbladder 40, for example, it's in the ankle joint, and it's usually talked about as being used for helping people who have trouble walking. I think of it as helping people who have trouble moving forward, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. If they are having trouble walking forward, you can use gallbladder 40 to help them with that. That make sense? That answer the question? Okay. Nicole, I appreciate your enjoyment of the name of the cat. I was very happy with that name too. Fergus. Allison, you got a question?
I do. I'm not sure if this is a legitimate question to ask, but in terms of thinking about yin yang pairs and their pathology and patterns, is there a general framework for the yin organ will have these sort of tendencies and the yang will have these due to just like heat versus cold, or, you know, hollow and solid?
Geez,
it's more for like kind of sorting everything in my mind.
That's a good question. Totally. The answer is that I'm going to do long answer first and then short answer.
Okay.
Long answer is every pair is different. You got to look at them all uniquely. The stomach and spleen are basically the same in terms of yin and yang. Like they're really intimately connected. The liver and gallbladder are decently intimately connected. The kidney and the urinary bladder are very divergent. So there is a lot of difference. Short answer, yin is long-term, yang is short-term. So if we're looking at an issue that's arisen recently within the wood element, we might be looking more towards the gallbladder. And if we're looking at a lifelong pattern or a multi-year pattern, we might be looking more at the liver. The hollow organs move things through quickly. The yin organs store things long-term. If you want to work with someone on a deep level, you're looking at the yin organs more than the yang organs. The yin organs tend to be more internal and the yang organs tend to be more external. So if you're looking at someone who's having more trouble working with the wood element inside their own system, like figuring out what they want to move forward towards in their life on like an existential, like what is my purpose sort of a level, we might be looking a little bit more at the yin aspect. If we're looking more at actually going out in the world and doing it, we might be looking more at the yang aspect. Those are two different ways, brief heuristic methods to look at those.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Questions like that about like, how should I think, about like, how should I think about this? How should I fit this in my head are really good questions to be asking at this stage. So if you guys have more of those, keep them coming. Okay, let's, if other questions come up, we'll go ahead and ask. But we're going to talk about the San Jiao, which is, this is gallbladder again. Second. San Jiao's a little harder to talk about. That's okay. Yeah. That's not San Jiao either. Okay, we're going to talk about the urinary bladder first, because that's how my computer wants to do it. So, urinary bladder, again, this is going to be something where we're going to be talking a bit about urinary bladder as an organ, but remember that this is one where the channel is dramatically different, right? So the channel is going to do 10,000 things. The organ doesn't do a whole lot. So what does the urinary bladder do? Statements of fact, governs the storage of turbid yin and yang. So like the large intestine, it's going to store turbidity, things we want to get out of us, in this case, fluids. The second statement of fact is, if its qi transformation occurs, turbid fluids are exited. So there's a transformation in the qi that has to occur within the urinary bladder. And when it does, we're able to urinate. So from the small intestine, turbid fluids are sent to the urinary bladder. The kidney yang provides qi and heat for qi transformation because the urinary bladder doesn't really have any of its own to use here. It comes from the kidney. And then the urinary bladder transforms fluid and excretes urine. There's a certain amount of fluids that are brought back into the body at this point as well. So really there should be another arrow coming back towards the kidneys, or to the, not the kidney yang, but the kidneys in general, of clear fluids coming out of the bladder. But for the most part, it's just excretory. Just like with the gallbladder, we can look at urination from a bunch of different angles. All of these things come together to make urination happen. So if a patient's coming in and they're urinating too frequently, or they're having trouble urinating, we have a lot of different things to look at. So someone who's really stressed, the liver might be blocking up the flow of qi and making it hard for the person to urinate. Someone with severe kidney yang deficiency is going to not have the qi and heat for the qi transformation that occurs in the urinary bladder, which often results in the person having dribbling urination and cloudy urination. The small intestine is going to separate the fluids that go to the urinary bladder in the first place. So if the small intestine has a problem and isn't separating the clear from the turbid, then the person might have really watery diarrhea and then not be urinating. The sun Jiao is going to help the separation, transformation, and excretion of fluids. We'll talk about the sun Jiao next, so don't worry about that for now. And the lungs are going to descend qi to help with the excretion of urination. So for example, if we look at an herb that all of you know, ma huang, it goes to the lungs and the urinary bladder. And it does all that, like release the exterior, promote sweating, stop coughing and wheezing, all of that. It also promotes urination. It does that because it is bitter and acrid, and it drains downwards in addition to venting outwards. So it helps to reestablish the proper up and down movement of the lungs, and it also descends the qi down the urinary bladder to aid with urination. So if any of you are wondering why ma huang promotes urination despite being a release exterior herb, it's the connection to the lungs and the urinary bladder directly. General urinary bladder pathology, signs and symptoms. No surprise, urinary problems, right? Anytime a patient has a urinary problem, we might be thinking about the urinary bladder organ. We're also going to see any issues arising in the lower jiao related to fluid metabolism, either dampness, dryness, rashes, signs of turbidity in the lower jiao. We're thinking urinary bladder organ. So for example, if a person has a tendency to not completely void their urine and it's full of turbidity, we might expect that turbidity to begin affecting the surrounding areas. When you have patients that come in with, there's a bunch of different areas for rashes in the lower jiao, a tendency towards rashes on like the backs of their legs, let's say, like backs of the thighs, especially if those rashes are a little bit, tend to be very damp, like a lot of leaking of fluids out of them, or a patient who gets a lot of edema in the lower body, but their spleen seems healthy, you know, the normal organs we would think of seem healthy, we might be looking at their urinary bladder not getting the turbidity out and therefore having the turbidity accumulate. And urinary bladder has a strong connection with jealousy and suspicion. I don't have a very complete understanding of why jealousy and suspicion would be related to the urinary bladder, in part because I haven't treated many patients where jealousy or suspicion seem to be major factors. So this isn't something I've really had to think through very much. I had a patient briefly who had a long history of dislocating their fifth toe. It happened a ton of times. It would dislocate almost spontaneously. They couldn't really get it to stay in the proper place. Doctors had talked about fusing the bones together. And that's the end of the urinary bladder channel. And that person had a tendency to be very suspicious, but they also had a bunch of trauma in earlier years of their life, and I didn't see them long enough, and I was too early in my practice to really be able to parse what was going on. Hopefully I'll get to see more people like that. Jealousy and suspicion are just not things I'm encountering that much clinically. So I don't have a ton to say here. You can make an argument that there's an aspect of fear to both jealousy and suspicion, in that it could be connected to the kidneys, but there's they're not emotions that I understand super well within the Chinese medicine system. So I'm going to have to basically leave that there. But you should definitely know, for exam purposes, jealousy and suspicion are related to the urinary bladder for your comps and your boards, which means for my class too. Okay. External pathogenic factors. So the urinary bladder is both very deep in the body and at the outside of it, just like the large intestine, right? On the one hand, everything's processed all the way through the body by the time things get to the urinary bladder, but at the same time, it's an exit point. So when we're looking at external pathogenic factors, we're looking at them penetrating directly from the outside through the urethra or through the lower jiao. I'll answer those questions in just one second. So external conditions of the same nature. So if a person's spending this is one of the reasons why you kind of want to keep the genital region, and in this case, we're talking more about the urethra, but the genital region, the waistline, you want to keep that area climatically controlled as much as you can. So you see this in a lot of traditional cultures where that's really the only area that gets wrapped. In very hot climates, and even in kind of chillier climates, there's extra layering there. These excretory, these are supposed to be one-way valves. And if pathogens start coming in, they can create a lot of problems. So just make sure that you're not getting your urethra extremely cold for no reason on a regular basis. It's pretty straightforward. It's on me. I'm surrounded by jealous people, wondering what I should look for. I'm not really sure. I mean, you know, if you're surrounded by people who have certain sorts of qualities, it's always important to make sure you're not creating more issues by getting too clinical with them. But it's, you know, there's a Confucian line that, like, when I meet a person, I search him for his virtues and I try to learn them, and I search him for his vices and I search myself for those as well. So, you know, if you find yourself being surrounded by a lot of jealous people, trying to figure out what is it in them that makes them want to be jealous. Often there are interesting ways to have those conversations. Yeah, but be careful, because if they're jealous, you don't necessarily want too much attention. And Danielle, my first thought was murky water for jealousy and suspicion. I like that. I mean, we are talking about the water element, and we are talking about things accumulating. Generally, when we see that sort of murkiness, we're getting into more of a phlegmy territory where it's a question of not being able to see properly, or distortion, which certainly could lead to jealousy and suspicion. Yeah, that's something to think about. I like that. All right, emotions. So the urinary bladder is affected by fear and shock, which can lead to a sinking of qi and urination. We see this primarily when we're looking at children who are frightened. We talked about this back when we were talking about the kidneys, that sudden shocks can cause children mostly to urinate because it causes, or lots of fear can cause children to urinate because it causes the qi to descend. Excuse me. But really, the kidney controls the lower orifices. We could argue that it controls the opening and closing of the urethra through its kidney-yang connection to the urinary bladder. But in adults, oftentimes that sort of fear and shock will just result in fainting. And part of the reason for that is that the urinary bladder is sufficiently strong that it's not damaged by that descent. But yeah, fear and shock can cause qi to sink and can cause urination. Excess sexual activity can also affect the urinary bladder. So too much sexual activity, and here we're talking for men, too much ejaculation damages the kidney yang over time, and you need kidney yang for the urinary bladder to do its qi transformation. So it tends to result in excessive amounts of urination. When you do that qi transformation in the urinary bladder, you've got your turbid fluids, and the qi transformation is taking out the last bit of what is good and really marking the rest for excretion. And in this case, you're just losing extra fluids. So this is one of the reasons why often why it's not that uncommon for people to use the bathroom after sex. I mean, there are health reasons, especially for women, but it's also the draining of the kidney often results in the need to urinate. So as we're seeing here, like the emotions, fear and shock, we're kind of talking about the kidneys. Sexual activity, we're kind of talking about the kidneys. So a lot of the urinary bladder's problems are really kidney problems that happen through the urinary bladder, right? So if a person has had too much sex over the course of their life, and that means too much sex for them, it could be a completely reasonable amount for someone else, and they've ended up with kidney yang deficiency, and because of that they have frequent urination, we might be treating them almost exclusively through the kidneys. Like the fact that they have a problem in their urinary bladder here doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to use a single point on the urinary bladder. We may, but we're going to be focusing mostly on getting the kidneys tonified to deal with this urinary bladder problem. Excessive physical exercise, same as excessive sexual activity, it can damage the kidney yang. So really, we could take these slides here, and if you jump back to the kidney section and you look at what damages kidney yang, you've got the same list of things that cause damage to the urinary bladder. Very straightforward. What's considered excessive exercise? So some professors and some teachers are going to give you very prescriptive answers to these sorts of things, like excessive sex means no more than twice per week in the winter if you're 30, and those sorts of things, which I don't take much stock in those sorts of numbers. So excessive exercise is exercise that begins to result in signs of kidney yang deficiency. If you're getting symptoms of kidney yang deficiency, then you're doing too much exercise. I prefer to answer the question that way because it's going to be individual to the person. You know, someone who's been a ultra marathon runner for 20 years is going to have a different exercise tolerance than someone who's lived on the couch for the past 20 years and has no kidney yang left. So it's dependent on the person. If you begin getting low back pain, like kidney type low back pain, low back and knee pain, that might be a sign. I would go back to the kidney slides and look at what kidney yang deficiency looks like. And if you begin getting those symptoms, it's probably too much exercise. Okay, urinary bladder pathology. So tend towards dampness, and then it's gonna be hot or cold. So if we're looking at damp heat, then it's gonna be frequent and both of these have frequent and urgent urination. Either way, the person suddenly has to go and has to go badly. If it's damp heat, then the urine is going to tend to burn a little bit as it comes out. Doesn't necessarily mean they have a UTI, just a sensation of heat locally in the urethra. And if it's cold, it's going to come more with heaviness and a feeling of distension and perhaps pain in just the entire pelvic region or in areas of the pelvic region. That's because cold tends to contract things, right? And then that contraction leads to stagnation, which can cause pain, and the burnings because heat is hot. The damp heat tends to have difficulty stopping, as does the damp cold. And the damp heat tends to be dark and turbid, which means somewhat cloudy, and might involve some blood, in which case we are talking about something that has to be taken a little more seriously. And if we're talking about damp and cold, then it tends to be clear and cloudy. So very little color, but also a cloudiness to it. For cold, can it be a wind-cold invasion? There actually are wind-cold patterns that involve the urinary bladder. This is something that we were going to be talking about in the Shanghan Lun section. The Shanghan Lun describes wind-cold patterns that directly affect the urinary bladder. But in this case, I wouldn't think about that too much. I wouldn't worry about that for now. Yes, the cold can be caused by wind-cold invasion, but I think I'm going to leave that there. And you can look those patterns up if you want to. And the other one is a deficient and cold bladder. So this is deficiency meaning kidney yang deficiency, right? The bladder itself is not going to have deficiency. Is it deficient in cold? It's deficient because the kidney yang is deficient, and it's cold because the yang brings the heat that causes the transformation. So basically, damp, heat, and cold is the excess version. It can go either way. You can have fire here as well, but we tend to talk about that as a heart fire condition because that's where it comes from. So you could have fire in the urinary bladder, but it's not coming from, it's even less urinary bladder related than the kidney yang stuff is. These are the excess presentations, one hot, one cold, and a deficient pattern that happens to also be cold because you're deficient in heat. So here you get frequent, pale, and abundant urination. So the person's just peeing all the time. Often with this sort of patient, you're going to see dryness signs other places because they're just peeing. Incontinence, they can't, so it's the kidney yang, the kidney's in charge of the opening and closing of the lower orifices, and it's really the kidney yang that's in control of that. So when the kidney yang is weak, the person can't control the opening and the closing. So this can be incontinence. It can also be difficulty urinating as well, tends to be incontinence. Enuresis. I'm just completely blanking on what that word means right now. So I'm looking it up. Oh yeah, okay, that's just difficulty controlling urination. Okay, that's easy. That's repetitive. Low backache. So the low backache has nothing to do with the urinary bladder. That's just kidney yang deficiency. Dizziness, kidney yang deficiency. Nocturia, urinating at night. So oftentimes patients with kidney yang deficiency, you can kind of check in with patients, especially as they get older, like how many times are you urinating per night? There's some patients who will say they urinate 5, 6 times a night. So that's fairly severe nocturia. If that's happening, then they're also not getting the benefits of sleep, right? And that's going to further damage their system. White urethral discharge, this can happen for both men and women. In men, this means spermatorrhea, that they're leaking sperm with, they're leaking semen with their urine, and a feeling of cold, which is just yang deficiency. I've got a private question. If the intake of water matches urination, it's okay, right? In reference to what? So, I mean, you should not be urinating as much water as you drink because you should also be sweating and losing water through other actions of the body, right? There's a bunch of different ways that we get water out of our system, get fluids out of our system. The question from a Chinese medical perspective is there accumulation of turbid fluids that you need to get out? And are you properly recycling fluids? So, for example, a person can drink 1.5 gallons of water every day, urinate 1 gallon of water every day and sweat a ton and still be dry inside because at no point did that water become fluids within their system. In that case, you know, on the one hand, great, they're drinking a lot, they're urinating fairly clearly, that's good. On the other hand, they're dry, so it's not working. Other patients can drink a lot of water, and I mean, I've seen patients, and I've traveled enough and been in enough weird health situations that like sometimes you're drinking 1 gallon of water a day and you're barely urinating because you're just sweating so much. You know, once you hit that like 95 degrees and 100% humidity sort of weather where you're like, I don't know how people live here, where I personally don't know how people live here full time. Yeah, I mean, you can just lose all of that through sweat. So it depends. The question is, does the person have enough fluids in the places we want them to have fluids, and are they getting turbidity out? And we define that based on symptoms. Are they showing symptoms of that going wrong? Does phlegm ever make it to the lower jiao? If not, why? Yeah, phlegm absolutely gets to the lower jiao. Phlegm in the lower jiao is a fairly large issue. It tends not to be an issue in the urinary bladder. We don't have a lot of phlegm in the urinary bladder. I'm trying to think of exceptions to that. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but I can't really think of any right now. We see a lot of phlegm in the intestines showing up. So within like dysenteric conditions or irritable bowel conditions, we see the phlegm manifest. Like blood and phlegm in the stool, blood and pus in the stools, with pus being more or less a type of phlegm. phlegm nodules accumulating in the lower body. We see a lot of sexually transmitted diseases manifest in phlegm-like manners on the skin. A lot of this is liver Luo related. So you guys know about the Luo channels, right? If you look at a meridian, then they have their branches, and those branches can store pathology. The liver Luo wraps around the genitals, and it often ends up storing phlegm. The Dai meridian around the waist can have a lot of phlegm in it as well. Yeah, there's lots of ways there's phlegm in the lower jaw. That's the answer. That's about it for the urinary bladder. So the urinary bladder is kind of interesting, but as an organ, it just doesn't do a whole lot. It's there as an excretory organ, much like the large intestine is, but unlike the large intestine, it's pretty passive. It holds mostly turbid fluids. Kidney yang gives it some energy to help transform those fluids, and it lets them out or it doesn't. But mostly we're seeing it as an organ, as an extension of kidney yang. As a channel, it's one of the most important, maybe the most important in the body. As an organ, it's one of the least, it's not that it's unimportant, but that as an organ, it doesn't really do anything itself. It's mostly acted upon by other organs to get the job done. Make sense? Okay. Any questions? All right. One second. And let's just go right into this third one. We'll take a break at 5 after. We're making good time today. So if we get through this as well, Sanjiao's a little bit longer, a lot longer. Okay, let's see how far we get here, and then we'll go from there. Sanjiao is a fascinating organ. I would say that I've got a decent understanding of the Sanjiao as Chinese medicine practitioners go, but the Sanjiao is hard. So let's do our best here. I've included some statements of fact from other sources to try to help triangulate what the Sanjiao is and how it works. Don't worry too much about, we'll trim down these notes. This page is the only page of statements of fact that you need to know for exams and things. I included a whole bunch of others from other sources to try to give extra information because this one's a little confusing. The other pages say not tested on them, so don't worry about it. But if you feel like, whoa, this is too much information, you're not going to be tested on a lot of this. Okay. In my class or on boards and comps, but I feel like the information that's given just for the boards and comps is not enough to get a feel for the Sanjiao. So the Sanjiao mobilizes the original or yuan qi. When we say mobilize in this case, here it's kind of the pathway through which it travels. So when we say like a spark comes up from the kidney to the heart to aid in the creation of blood, the way that it travels to the heart is through the Sanjiao. The Sanjiao is that which is going to carry it up there. Controls the transportation and the penetration of qi. So the spleen governs transformation and transportation, but the Sanjiao is where the transportation takes place. So if the spleen and the stomach produce qi and they decide, and we've treated them and we say like, okay, this qi is going to the heart, that's where you're sending it, that's going to happen through the Sanjiao as well. If we're creating fluids that are, if that qi needs to get into something, the Sanjiao is that which is going to penetrate through and enter into something. So to get to the heart, we've got to go through structures. Well, the Sanjiao's got the pathway that goes through things as well. The Sanjiao also controls the water passages and the excretion of fluids. So all of water metabolism in the body, all fluid movement in the body, all happens through the Sanjiao. It's the official in charge of irrigation, which you might remember from earlier, which is how we one of the other ways we say this. Oftentimes the Sun Jiao gets talked about as if it's the lymphatic system because of this. And there's a lot of overlap, but the Sun Jiao does so much more. So yes, it controls the water passages and excretion of fluids, much like the lymphatic system does, but don't make that one-to-one correlation too quickly. It controls the ascending and descending and entering and exiting of qi in all organs and all parts of the body. So that's, anytime in Chinese medicine I bump up against those sorts of phrases, part of me goes, okay, that's too big of a statement. It's kind of hard to parse that. What do you mean all organs and all parts of the body? And controls, this feels big. And the idea here is that, again, it's through the Sun Jiao that all ascending and descending happens. So when we say the spleen is in charge of lifting, the spleen governs the raising of qi in the body. It's like, well, where is the qi being raised through? What is the medium in which qi movement is occurring? It's happening through the Sun Jiao. Same with the descending. If the lungs have gotten obstructed and so they're no longer bringing the qi down from the head or the fluids down from the head, and so we're getting a swollen face with the common cold, the place that it's not bringing the qi down through is the Sun Jiao. Entering and exiting of qi in all organs, all parts of the body. At night, when a yin deficient patient has night sweats, that's because the yang energy can't be brought into the person's body, right? Well, that entering that isn't happening is not happening through the Sun Jiao. When the yang energy instead goes outwards and the person sweats, that exiting is happening through the Sun Jiao. It's exiting through the Sun Jiao. We're going to talk about the three burners in different ways as well. There's a bunch of different ways to talk about the Sun Jiao. So for now, just maybe get slightly overwhelmed by these statements of fact, and we'll clarify in a minute. The upper burner is like a mist, the middle burner is like a foam, and the lower burner is like a sluice. We're going to use different words for this again in a second to help clarify this. This partially gets to, Allison, your question about phlegm in the lower jiao. One of the reasons we don't see phlegm in the lower jiao in the same way is because when we see phlegm in the upper jiao, it tends to stand alone in the same way that that phlegm in a misty area doesn't really interact with the environment very much. But when we see phlegm in the lower jiao, it's more like a bunch of scum traveling down an estuary or a river. It's within a fluid-filled area naturally. So the sluice, often sometimes called a drainage ditch as well, when we see phlegm in that area, it doesn't manifest quite as cleanly, clearly, and separately as it does when it's in the lungs or it's in the nose, because those areas should be cleaner and clearer and less drainage ditch-like. So part of this is that the upper burner is more yang and relatively empty, misty. The middle burner is in between, it's kind of foamy. Yes, there's stuff there, but it's still not very full. And then the lower burner is quite full. Let's get into, we're going to see some different language with these statements of fact, but I think some of this is important. Again, not being tested on this, but I'd recommend you learn it anyways. So the Sun Jiao has a name, but no form. So we talk about the Sun Jiao, but we're not expecting to be able to pull out a physical substance and say, this is the Sun Jiao. Like the gallbladder, we talked early in the semester about like this mind map organization where if we're talking about blood, we have in the center the character for blood, and then physical blood is one of the things that's related to it. Same thing with heart. If we're talking about heart, we're talking about the Shen, we're talking about all of these things, and one of them is the physical heart. But at the center of the idea of the heart is just the idea. We're talking about the same Sun Jiao. There is no physical form to connect it to. We're not expecting to see a physical structure anywhere that is the Sun Jiao. So it has a name, but no form. The Sun Jiao is also one name, but three different things at the same time. So we say Sun Jiao, but really we're talking about three things, but maybe more. We'll get to that in a second. So where is the upper jiao, the middle jiao, and the lower jiao? Well, we have definitions of this. From the head to the heart is the upper jiao. From the heart to the navel is the middle jiao, and the navel to the feet is the lower jiao. That's your division. Usually when they say heart here, they mean Ren 17. The point in the chest. Sometimes it's argued that it's Ren 15. So it's either the bottom, it's either the xiphoid process or between the nipples and the rib cage. One of those 2 points for where heart is, and then navel straightforward. So this is a very long statement of fact. And I think I'll probably just leave this up on the break for you guys to look at as well. The Sanjiao is the function of ministerial fire. We're not really talking about imperial versus ministerial, but that could be a good talk for next week. One second, let me take a note of that. Because I'm trying to figure out what to include at the end of this semester. We've got a lot of options. This could be a good one. The triple burner is the function of ministerial fire. So we have the ministerial fire sitting in the kidneys, and it's working down there to heat up the body, to do qi transformations within the urinary bladder, to balance fire above and below with the heart. And when it does things, it does it through the Sanjiao. So the Sanjiao is the function of ministerial fire. It divides and spreads life gate source qi, Ming Men, kidney. So it's spreading that, remember statements of fact here, mobilizes the Yuan qi. It divides and spreads the Yuan qi. It rules uprearing, moving upwards, and downbearing, exiting and entering. It parades between heaven and earth. That's just floofy. It is the overall understanding of the qi of the 5 viscera and 6 bowels, the yin and wei, the channels and network vessels, the internal and external, the above and below, left and right. Well, that's a lot of things. Part of what I take away from that sentence is that the Sanjiao really is a network that penetrates pretty much everywhere in the body. And because of that, you know, we can look at the gallbladder and we know things about what's going on with the gallbladder, look at the lung, things about what's going on with the lung. The Sanjiao is that which knits everything else together. Through the Sanjiao, in theory, we should be able to see every other aspect of the body. It is the business house of the bowel of central essence. So we've got some debate about what the central essence is. We're just going to leave that sentence for now. Above, it governs absorption. In the middle, it governs transformation. And below, it governs exiting. So lots of stuff in what was presented as one statement of fact. These are from Bob Flaws, by the way. That's what the BF is. So the triple burner is the official of the sluices. So all drainage pathways in the body are controlled by this triple burner. And it homes to the gallbladder, to the urinary bladder. I don't quite know what he means by homes, but I think the idea here is that as turbidity is created anywhere in the body, the Sanjiao is steering and directing that towards the urinary bladder. The triple burner is the source of defense of wei and yin. Well, the wei and the yin are going to travel through the Sanjiao. So it being the source, I think in this case means the home of them. The 3 burners are a human's 3 sources of qi. So in this case, I think what they're talking about are the 3 dantian in the body. You guys are probably aware of the dantian that's at Ren 6. There's 3 different ones, each one manifesting as one of the burners. The 3 burners are the passageways and streets of water and grain. This is how we move fluids and nutrition through the body. If we want qi and blood to move around, if we want the products of water and grain to move around, they move through the Sanjiao. The Sanjiao are the parting and courier of the original qi and govern the free flow and movement of the 3 qi, which pass through the 5 viscera and 6 bowel. That'd be yin, wei, and yuan qi for the 3 qi. Okay, almost done. The lower burner governs liver and kidney diseases. the Ximbao Luo, the heart wrapper network and the pericardium, and the Sanjiao stand in an, well, that just means that pericardium and Sanjiao are a pair. We already know that. So that's I think our next longest set of, that's all the statements of fact. For the other organs, the most statements of fact I included were 2 pages, and here we've got 5 pages. And all of that is to say that the Sanjiao is hard. And anyone who says the Sanjiao isn't hard either doesn't understand the Sanjiao, is lying to you, or is much, much, much smarter than I am. The Sanjiao is hard for a few reasons. The first is that it's kind of confusing because we're talking about multiple things at the same time. One of the statements of fact was that the Sanjiao is both 3 things and 1 thing at the same time. So it's confusing. It has a form in that it's this pathway through which things like fluids move. It's cavities of the body, right? I mean, it has a form in that we have an upper, middle, and lower. We can talk about the physical places where the Sanjiao is. But at the same time, it's an animation, it's pure function. And it has no physical form. That's been stated. Elizabeth Rochette-Vallée, who's one of the authors that I'm studying at this stage of my clinical experience, has this quote in her, I don't have it at hand, I've got a book from her on the Sanjiao. Sanjiao, the triple heater, is one of the most difficult concepts to grasp in Chinese medicine, not only because as an entity it has no equivalent in Western medicine, but also because in China itself, it has not been clearly and plainly defined. So we have quite a few of these areas in Chinese medicine. Phlegm is one of them, the Sanjiao is one of them, where there's been debate for 1,000+ years about what exactly it is that's going on. And one of the reasons these debates are interesting is I don't really think they're supposed to be fully answered, or rather they're supposed to be a myriad set of answers which are functional in different ways in different situations. As far as I can tell, there are 4 different ways, 4 different things that we're talking about when we're talking about the Sanjiao. I should really put this as. So on the one hand, the Sanjiao is a yang organ. On the other hand, it's the mobilizer of yuan qi and other qi and fluids. Sometimes when we say Sanjiao, we're just talking about 3 different divisions of the body. And sometimes we're actually talking about the spaces inside the body. So this makes it hard to talk about the Sanjiao, because when I say Sanjiao, which one of these am I talking about? So let's start with yuan mobilizing. So the Sanjiao moves that yuan qi out of the kidneys and up to the rest of the body. So got this graphic here. Anytime you hear that like kidney qi comes up to do a function, it's happening through the Sanjiao. So when we say that like the spleen is in charge of raising all qi in the body, well, it's going to raise the qi through the Sanjiao. But also, if the kidney yang is weak, then the kidney yang doesn't come up through the Sanjiao to support the spleen in raising things through the Sanjiao. Yeah. So it warms the spleen to transform and transport by bringing warmth up from the kidneys. It helps transform the zong qi into the zhen qi in the chest. We can also look at it as just 3 jiao. So upper jiao, each one of these having a different qi. The zong qi in the upper jiao, the ying qi in the middle jiao, and wei qi starting in the lower jiao, but then being carried up to the lungs and out. So it's the transporter of all these different qi. Danielle, what about the animation of the body? For the 4 views, could it be postural, how someone moves? No. That's going to be governed by a few other things. So the actual physical movement of the body, that's organs we've already talked about, plus some extraordinary ones. So like, how about the core? There's nothing muscular here. There's nothing about physical movement of the body here. This is just movement of unseen things, more circulatory than animation within that sense. In terms of posture and how someone moves, we're mostly looking at the chows for that, the yin and the yang chow. And for posture, we're looking at things like the lifting of qi and the ren and the du more within my perspective. How about core? If you're talking about core muscles, I think I covered that. Okay. You need to know this. This is where the organs are, or the effect of a strong core. So when I think strong core, what I hear is strong core muscles. When you say strong core here, I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you mean like a strong functioning set of dantian, which could be argued to be a core from a Chinese medical perspective, then maybe. But I'm not quite sure what you mean by strong core here. This is healthy internal circulation. If your sanjiao is working well, your core might be strong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got the upper jiao, middle jiao, and lower jiao. Should probably be consistent. The interesting thing here is that, so lower jiao is from the urinary, is from the the navel downwards, yet the liver and gallbladder are usually talked about as being in the lower jiao. This is something that you'll probably hear people go back and forth on, whether it's in the middle or the lower jiao. According to the Nanjing, it's in the lower jiao. I don't have much to say about that. I mean, it's very clear from the Huangdi Neijing that the Chinese, real ancient Chinese medical practitioners were doing dissections. They have listed weights for all the organs that are close enough. So they were doing some sort of dissection at that time period. They would have known that physically the liver and gallbladder weren't in the lower jiao, but they'd also know that the kidneys are largely not below the navel. So the reasoning for this might have more to do with metaphorical functioning, that these things exist within the sluice of the body, within the drainage ditch of the body, rather than within the foamy middle jiao, which is really just the stomach and spleen. But some other people argue that it's in the stomach and spleen just because that's between the navel and the heart. So I'm going to refer to the classics here. This is the other set of phrases that gets used. The upper jiao being like a mist is consistent. Sometimes the middle jiao is called a foam. Sometimes the middle is called a maceration chamber, a place where things are chewed. And the lower jiao gets called a sluice, which is not exactly contemporary English. So I like drainage ditch better. Danielle, does it have to do with type of qi for liver and gallbladder? You mean the fact that they're in the lower jiao? Maybe. Let's take a break here and let me think about that for a second. It's time for a break regardless. I gotta use the bathroom. So let's take a break here for a second. Let me think about that and come back. Can I explain dantian? Yes, I can. 10 minutes. So everyone come back at 3:15 and we can talk about dantian and types of qi. Be right back. We got one more hour, and I've posted a whole bunch of stuff in the chat here. I'll get that up on Moodle Slack, but just download these here now. I got 2 example quizzes for you, and a couple of excerpts from Ross's book, Common Acupuncture Point Combinations, I think. Suddenly blanking on which one of his books these are from, but it should say in them. The energy body, which, well, I could spell that correctly, is a good resource for beginning to go a little bit deeper into things like what the dantian are. So there are multiple books that talk about how the energy body is constructed within a Chinese medicine perspective. And again, you don't have to, when we say energy body, that doesn't have to mean woo-woo. That doesn't have to mean off on Xenu. It can just be a metaphorical way of understanding how the body interacts. So it can be functionally useful without being true in the same way that body hair is true. So I'd recommend looking through the Energy Body PDF for more details on that. We once again run into the problem that he's going to translate some things differently. So in the types of points PDF here, he's going to talk about things like sheet cleft points as accumulation points. You should be able to follow it. Obviously, none of this is exam related, just trying to give a little bit more of a perspective. If you like how he writes, you should probably get his book and check that out. I often find that there are a lot of different authors in the Chinese medicine sphere who are semi-known, with Ross being one of them. And, you know, if you resonate with someone, go deep into their work. And I've also got the Possession PDF here, so we'll go into that today if we finish Sanjiao and still have some time. See how far we get. Yeah, I don't have a ton to say about that Qi question from earlier. I'm slightly shaky on my understanding of how the different Jiaos connect to different Qi. I've got the statements of fact, right? I've got the Qi being divided in this sort of a way, and I've got some understanding of the mechanism through which way Qi arises from the lower Jiao and then moves up to the upper Jiao through actually the lung pathway through the Sun Jiao. But whether or not the liver and why the liver and gallbladder are put into the lower Jiao, especially you can make an argument around their Qi being more lower Jiao-y, more drainage ditchy, but, or perhaps less maceration chamber-like than the spleen and stomach being the middle Jiao. But I don't have a definitive answer for it. I can speculate, but that's all I got. Okay, so 3 divisions. So we talked about the 3 Jiaos as their types of Qi. We've talked about them as the organs they contain. We've talked about them as divisions of the body, but we can also talk about the Sun Jiao as an organ itself. So normally organs have form. So in this case, we're paired, it's an organ that's paired with the pericardium / the Xinju, but also sometimes we talk about it as formless. There's a traditional image of the Sun Jiao that almost looks like, I'll just draw this real quick. Almost looks a little bit like a car radiator, or perhaps like a circulatory system. That's not what I want to do. So oftentimes the organ itself, there's classical drawings for every single one of the organs. At some point I may have as a part of this class, but they're not wildly important. The Sun Jiao is often drawn something like this. With my understanding being that those are supposed to be hollow areas within the organ. So it's like a network itself. I've seen it drawn in more contemporary ways where those internal pieces are even more broken up. With the idea being, again, that it's some sort of network throughout the body. So if you wanted to draw like capillary exchange between an arteriole and a venule, this would not be the world's worst drawing for that. There are lots of different ways in which that drawing helps to show kind of what the form of the formless organ would be, but also is not helpful at all. But so I will share it with you to share my continued confusion about it. The Sun Jiao as an organ maintains free passage and letting out or excreting. So we have these different Qi here, Dong Qi in the upper Jiao, Ying Qi in the middle Jiao, and Wei Qi in the lower Jiao. but we also are going to let out qi in each of the jiaos. Wei qi is let out in the upper jiao, yin qi is let out in the middle jiao, and then fluids are let out in the lower jiao, which fits with the idea of it being a drainage ditch and homing to the urinary bladder. Right, so it's going to take in these fluids, bring them to the lower jiao, let them out. We can also talk about it as body cavities. So in addition to being the 3 jiaos, it's also all of the cavities in the body, which includes things like the pelvic cavity. It includes the spaces within joints. It includes joint cavities. It includes the soli, that space between the skin and the muscles where the wei qi travels, where the defensive qi travels. We can talk about it as being the area above the diaphragm. There's a whole set of herbal formulas that are related to the area above the diaphragm or below the diaphragm. Those are all based on Sanjiao theory from the 1400s. We can talk about it as being in between membranes within the body. Between membranes and the abdominal cavity, basically in the spaces between all of the things, excuse me, is where we would expect the Sanjiao to be. Or maybe more accurately, we could say, let all of the spaces in between other tissues be called Sanjiao. So again, these are, comparing this to how we've talked about other organs, there's a lot more to say here, but at the same time, for all of that saying, it's hard to tell how much of it is important. So if we talk about it as body cavities, the soli, I've covered soli in this class, right? A little bit, no, okay. Okay, that's important enough to do this really quick. Okay, so if we have skin, muscle, this right in here is the soli. And that's where the wei and the yin qi travel. That's if we're talking about like an external pathogen penetrating inwards, what we care about is where it gets stuck. So the pathogen might get stuck in the skin, might get stuck in the soli, might get stuck in the muscle. The soli is kind of, it's part of the Sanjiao that exists at the exterior of the body. It's like if you take, for anyone who does massage, whenever you do skin pull related techniques where you're pressing on the skin moves around and it's sliding over the tissues underneath. The spaces that are sliding, that's the soli. It's the place where the 2 different types of tissues connect. It's when you get a scar and then the skin won't move, that's because you've got a connection across the soli. It sometimes gets translated as interstices. Just another body cavity. Chat back up. So from the Lei Jing, outside the internal organs and inside the body, wrapping the internal organs like a net, there is a cavity that is a fu, that's a hollow young organ. It has the name of a ditch, but the shape of a hollow young organ of a fu. The internal organs have substance. The cavities are like a bag that contains that substance. So when we describe the Sanjiao, it's a bag that contains all of the other organs. Or the cavities themselves are a bag that contains, yeah. There's room for interpretation and for understanding here, for argument about this. But some people have talked about maybe the Sanjiao is all connective tissue in the body. But this would be the first organ that we get a one-to-one correlation with Western thought anyways, if that was true. So it seems to have some overlap with lymphatic system, with connective tissue, maybe with the nervous system as well. It plays a lot of different roles simultaneously, which is part of what makes it confusing. So kind of circulatory, everywhere and often affected, yet rarely a causal factor. So when we say, 1 second, Danielle, and I'll answer that. I've thought about that as well. So the Sun Jiao also doesn't really have pathology. We're going to get to the pattern differentiation next. But like when we say that, like when the liver stagnates qi, it's stagnating qi in places. Often it's stagnating qi within the Sun Jiao. And so the Sun Jiao is kind of everywhere, connects everything, is the pathway through which most things move, and is affected all the time. But the Sun Jiao itself doesn't create problems. So there's no soul there's no spirit connected with the Sun Jiao. There's no particular functions which are heavily given to it. In the same, like when the large intestine doesn't excrete waste because of its connection to other organs, these pathologies form there. We can see a psychological connection to it. The Sun Jiao doesn't really do any of that. The Sun Jiao is corridors through which things move. If you talk to 5-element people, they've got psychological connections that they use with the Sun Jiao. But within standard TCM, it's not really something that's considered. And in fact, we don't have any patterns for this, which we'll get to in a minute. So Danielle said, could the Sun Jiao be the entire body? Well, there are a decent number of statements that make it clear that it's like a bag that contains things, that it's a net that crosses across things. There's this idea, even within the image I showed a minute ago, my terrible little drawing, it's full of holes. So I don't think it's, because on the one hand, it sounds like they're describing everything, but on the other hand, it's a network. It's some sort of networking function inside of the body more than anything else. It controls exiting and entering. If it's the body, it controls exiting and entering out of what? Is it? So there are a lot of structures within the body, and the Sun Jiao seems to be the networking function more than anything else. So could it be the entire body? I would love to see someone do a deep dive into trying to make that argument, because it is confusing. I'll refer us back to Elizabeth Rashath's statement here. The Sun Jiao is one of the most difficult concepts to grasp in Chinese medicine, not only because as an entity it has no equivalent in Western medicine, but also because in China itself it has not been clearly and plainly defined. There are times when encountering phrases like, oh, it's like a net, it's like a bag that contains things. I wonder whether that was clear to the people who were saying it originally or not. And I read that and I go, what do I do with this? But they might read that and go, that's a complete statement. If you're not getting it, we don't really know what else to say. So let's talk about pathology with the Sun Jiao. There are no patterns. There's no damp heat in the Sun Jiao. There's no blood stagnation in the Sun Jiao. There's no yang deficiency in the Sun Jiao. There's nothing. Other patterns affect the Sun Jiao, but it doesn't have its own patterns. And let's use a couple references to back this up. So almost 0 herbs enter, which means directly affect the Sun Jiao. Like something like 50% of herbs are going to go to the stomach, spleen, large intestine, some combo of that. There aren't a lot of herbs that go to the pericardium. There aren't a lot of herbs that go to the gallbladder. I think there's one herb I can think of that goes to the Sun Jiao, but it's mostly related with, its main function is draining fluids out of the body. So that kind of makes sense. But it also might have come from a period where there was that was in vogue to do that. We don't go to the Sun Jiao with herbs. It doesn't how it works. There are no Sun Jiao patterns. If you try to look up Sun Jiao patterns in a book, it doesn't exist. There are body cavity patterns. There is a period of time in Chinese medicine where it's like, oh, this is an upper Jiao pattern. There's diagnosis by the Jiaos, but they're not Sun Jiao patterns. And even in those body cavity patterns, we're not using herbs that go to the Sun Jiao. We're using herbs that have a tropism, a directionality that goes to certain areas of the body. When it comes to acupuncture points, we got somewhat corrupted. So we'll clean this up as we go. The classic of difficulties says the Sanjiao is the envoy of the original qi. The places where the original qi resides are known as the Yuan source points. This passage therefore implies both that the original qi resides at the Yuan source points and that the Sanjiao is the transmitter of original qi. So when you use a Yuan source point, you're calling up qi through the Sanjiao to that point. As the Yuan source point of the Sanjiao channel, therefore, there's every reason to expect that Yang Chi, Sanjiao 4, would be an important point to strengthen the original qi in the treatment of diseases of deficiency. And Yang Chi, Sanjiao 4, is used for exactly this purpose in the Japanese tradition of acupuncture. It has also been suggested that Sanjiao 4 is effective to regulate the conception and penetrating vessels, the Ren and the Chong, in the treatment of disordered menstruation. Examining the classical Chinese records on the use of Yang Chi, Sanjiao 4, however, the following observations may be made. 1, it appears in very few traditional combinations. This is not a commonly used point even today. 1 second, I'm just gonna try to clean this up as we're going here. Why it wants to do that. 2, there are very few indications for its effectiveness in tonifying deficiency. 3, it has no gynecological indications. It is also interesting to note that Sanjiao 6 rather than Sanjiao 4 is indicated for blockage of the conception vessel in women. In clinical practice, the source point, the Yuan source point for the Sanjiao is principally used for wrist problems because that's where it is. It's like this system, this Sanjiao system that in theory should do so much in the body, the point that should be the most tonic point for this network system is used for local problems in the wrist, and that's about it. I don't quite know what to make of that. Normally, so this is one of the ways in Chinese medicine when you're confused about something, it's like, I don't really understand the gallbladder. You can start looking at points like this Yuan source point on the gallbladder channel, and it'll tell you what it treats, but it's also telling you what happens when you bring more qi to the gallbladder. So you can reverse engineer the function of the gallbladder from its source point to some degree. But when it comes to the Sanjiao, local problems. Wasn't Sanjiao introduced much later than herbs and acupuncture points? Nope. Huangdi Neijing, first text has the Sanjiao. Sanjiao is as old as Chinese medicine. I mean, that's after herbs and acupuncture points, like those predated the Huangdi Neijing, but that's kind of seen as the canonical source of academic Chinese medicine, and we're talking 2,200 years at that point, so ish. Debate about that. So all of this long, so Classic of Difficulties 6, we're going back, I think 1,400 years for that. All of this is to say that it's hard to know what to make of the Sanjiao. And this is what the points on the Sanjiao channel do in general. Most of what the points are, there are a couple exceptions, but those are related to other things, like the Yang Wei point on the Sanjiao channel. But in general, Sanjiao points clear heat, regulate fluids, and treat local issues. The Sanjiao channel is a fairly heavily used channel, but it's not used for particularly fancy functions. So for all of this stuff that the Sanjiao in theory does, its channel is, outside of a couple points, one of the least used, unless we're talking about local problems. It's great for shoulder pain if you're going to use points on the shoulder. So what's the takeaway here? The Sanjiao is clearly involved in a ton of different ways in the body, but it's doing it in a way that is very different from how the rest of the organs are. It has a form in the body. It's this net, it's this sac, it's this connective networking function, but at the same time, it doesn't have a form. there isn't a place that you can point to and say, that's the sun, excuse me, that's the sun Jiao. It's both a hollow organ, but it's also not a hollow organ. It doesn't have its own pathology. There's no sun Jiao damp heat. There is 0 patterns for the sun Jiao anywhere. But at the same time, basically every pathology affects the sun Jiao in one way or another. And it's interwoven through the entire body, yet we can't find it anywhere. So my understanding of this is still somewhat confused. I remember my FCM 4 teacher, I think, Yefim Gamgonishvili, who now teaches out in Seattle. He'd been in practice for, I think, 18 years when I had him as a teacher. And he was really excited that he felt like he was starting to understand the sun Jiao when he was teaching that class. So if this is confusing, that's correct. And that's okay. And out of all this stuff, you have to memorize almost none of it. I want you to know the statements of fact on this page, and that's it. The rest of this you don't have to know. I need you to know these words. I would like you to know also the other words that are used. So maceration chamber and drainage ditch for the middle and lower Jiaos. That's about it. But I also want you, hopefully, to get curious about the sun Jiao. A lot of the times when these things are presented in early education, it's taught as if those of us who have studied this understand it, and if you're having trouble, that's your own fault, and you just need to, you know, get more serious. But this is really a place where this is confusing. This is hard, and there's debate and argument about it. The foremost authorities on classical texts don't claim to understand it. Elizabeth Rachat is up there in terms of people who are respected for their understanding of the classics, and she's quick to say that this is not that this is arguably not something that's meant to be understood in a direct manner. So much like the pericardium, these two paraorgans together, I'd recommend that these be things that you pester your supervisors about. When using sun Jiao points, when using pericardium points in the clinic, ask your intern, so why are we using this point? What is it about the sun Jiao that makes this point the point to choose? Why are we using this pericardium point? Because both of these systems are difficult to understand, and the more you interact with them, the more you begin to get a picture of them. I apologize if that's a little bit frustrating, but that's also the most honest explanation I can give you guys. Anyone have any questions? I think if I taught that well enough, then there should just kind of be a fuzzy feeling and a feeling of like, well, of course I have questions, but you've already made an argument for why that's not going to be understandable. So yeah, I appreciate the people who caught the humor in that. It's a challenging thing. That is the most honest presentation of the sun Jiao I can give you. If you want to read through Maciocia and the like 3 pages he gives the sun Jiao, then you might walk away feeling, man, I don't get it. But I want you guys to walk away with the feeling that this isn't gotten in general. I follow an old acupuncturist. He mentioned that patient has sun qi. Well, sun just means 3, right? I assume that's the sun you're talking about. I don't know what sun qi is. There's sun paku, which is part of facial diagnosis around the eyes. There's an herb called sun qi, but I don't know what sun qi would be in this context. 3 level affects, upper affects the heart, lung, middle is liver and stomach. Yeah, so according to the classics, the liver would be on the bottom. It would be in the lower Jiao, but it's very common that people refer to the liver in the middle Jiao because of where the liver is. So I don't have a ton. There are people who I really like who I'm like, you're a great Chinese medicine practitioner. They're like, yeah, I know what the classics say, but the liver and the gallbladder are middle Jiao organs. Okay, you're getting good results. It's working clinically. Be nice to have better debate about these things, but hopefully that's coming more. Fuzzy, but understood okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, sun qi is not a diagnosis that I'm familiar with, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Zijun, you want to say anything about that? I'd be happy to hear a little something.
He's explaining to me, like, but it's still, like you said, it's not very clear the way he explains it because he's very old Chinese, so I'm still trying to understand it myself. But there's definitely some coordination that he believes that there's chi there that's not like going down or up, so it would create a hernia for a lot of patients. Like if he takes someone's pulse, then he'd be like, oh, you have lower back pain is because you have san chi. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's this might be coming from, there's a tradition where you do diagnosis about the balance of the three jiaos, where what you're asking is there like too much in one jiao versus another jiao? And it's supposed to be that the top is relatively young and empty, and the middle is balanced, and the low is fuller and heavier, but they're all supposed to be moving up and down between each other and integrating well. And and that's kind of TCM, but not really at the same time, at least as we do it in the West. And usually we just talk about like, oh, well, we might see the same situation as a hernia, but we might call it like spleen yang, qi not rising. But that's resulting in an accumulation in the lower jiao, maybe in the same sort of a way. So I think that's the sort of thing that can be discussed in a few different manners. Yeah, thanks. Liang, you want to translate that for me? Shanqi, yeah, Shanqi is mounting qi. That causes
that's what the sound sounds like and the description.
Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, yeah, and that's usually treated as a spleen yang deficiency or dampness accumulation thing. Okay, so it's 3:45. It's a bit of stuff today. Let me just double check that I'm not missing anything I feel like I should be getting. It's covered. I think we've covered most of what I really wanted to make sure we got through all that today. And since we have, we can talk about something else. I think this is pretty short. So let's do, we can do possession in 25 minutes here. I want to make sure you guys get some of this. This is a different way of talking about Chinese medicine. No exams, no nothing. You guys can, you have the notes. If you want to take notes, you can just listen to. Okay, so this is 5 elements. This is Worsley 5 elements stuff. You can get this information from Lonnie Jarrett's books, who I've mentioned before. Each of us who teaches tends to have a handful of people that we followed fairly closely, and we tend to reference them a bunch. So this is from him, and I found this stuff to be very useful, and well, I've done the treatments we're going to describe in here probably 500 times each. Okay. So within Chinese history, we don't have a soul, we have many souls. They come together at conception and birth, and they possess us. So the idea is that the physical form is a vessel for these other things that come in and are really us at a deeper level. At birth, they come together. At death, they separate out and go to other places. And that's the Hun, Po, Yi, Zhi, and Shen. And these spirits working together are what create our mind, are what create our intentionality, are what create at the deepest level who we are. So on top of that, we have cultural programming, we have the things we're taught, we have education, we have marketing, we have belief structures, we have philosophy, but deep under that, we have this constitution, this who we are. And that's largely made up of what the souls that inhabit us are. So there's this idea that who we are in the first place is almost a possession of the physical form by these souls. So when we say this, when we talk about possession in Chinese medicine, we're talking about the invasion of a gui, type of spirit, into the energetic form that we carry. And then the gui comes in and takes up residence in place of one of the souls that we're born with one of the spirits we're born with, or along with them. So we talk about especially the Shen being a whole group of spirits that sit in the heart void and the chest and the Shinju. And with shock, some of those can scatter and a gui can come in and take up residence. Once that gui is there at that deep level of us, it can influence our decision-making. Kind of in a similar way to how you look at cordyceps influencing ants. The idea being you could take someone who has one personality, they go through some sort of an event, a gui invades them, they come out and their personality is different. Their value system might be different. And the treatment for this is a treatment so you talk about treatment principles, and then we talk about treatment. So a treatment principle might be like drain damp. And then the treatment is how we do that. And in this case, the treatment of possession is called putting the emperor back on the throne. With the idea being that we want to reconnect, we want to make sure that the person's spirits are aligned properly with their body. Lonnie uses this line, restoring memory of original nature to the patient. And we do that by calling up the person's resources to eject the gui, eject the spirit out of their system. And this is important because in theory, and this has been my experience in practice, if a patient needs this to be done and it isn't done, you can't really get anywhere until you take care of this. Until the person's spirits are properly lined up, good luck getting them better. There is no possession in TCM. This isn't a concept in the box of TCM, but you see it show up historically. But the idea of these spirits don't fit very well with CCP philosophy, and so they're not really, they didn't make it through the transition within the medicine. Sure, you guys have seen this image before, this pictogram, logogram. So it's up here we have, this is the image for medicine. We have an archer firing an arrow at evil spirits over a bottle containing herbal wine. So the idea of, going back to the classics and scholarly work on the early histories of Chinese medicine, there was a large aspect of dealing with evil spirits in it originally. A lot of that didn't make it through, but some aspects of it did until TCM. So how does a person become possessed? When someone gets overwhelmed, then their system begins breaking down. So we talk about like shock scattering the qi, but this can also be extreme fatigue. If their wei qi is sufficiently weak, especially if there's a traumatic aspect to this that causes the shen to scatter. So any sort of dissociative experience, you'll hear people who go through traumatic experiences talk about feeling like they were watching it happening to themselves, for example, or feeling like they weren't in the room while things were occurring. Those are all ways in which those are all periods of time during which gui can get in. This can happen when people have high enough fevers to hallucinate or dissociate. Basically anything that causes dissociation, that's the key word, which means that the hun has partially left the person's body. So it's like a waking dream state associated with terrible experiences. During those times, it's easy to become possessed. Yes, PTSD is if I have a patient who comes in who's suffering from PTSD, the protocol we're going to end this set of slides with is the first thing that I will do. Almost every time. So is this real? Like we're talking about possession, like it's like there's actual spirits that comes into the person's body. So just like most of Chinese medicine, it's a useful way of thinking. It's a useful heuristic. We certainly can see people who go through a traumatic experience and have a personality change afterwards. That's a thing that happens. So it's real in that sense. Whether or not there's a literal spirit that comes into their body and whether or not these points wake up some internal energy in them to expel those spirits, I don't care. It's clinically effective. So it's a good way to help eliminate cognitive dissonance and irrationality in patients. So how do you diagnose someone with possession? So you're looking for odd behavior in the patient, like a lack of shen present in the eyes. So it almost looks like their eyes are clouded. So this is going to fit a lot of the phlegm misting the heart criteria. But the traits we're looking for the most are narcissism, obsession, lack of light in the eyes, a pulse which is changing consistently under your fingers. So as you feel the person's pulse, it's like, oh, that's kind of rapid. Now it's normal. Okay, so there's a lot of excess here. When excess is going away, okay, it's kind of deficient. As it keeps changing, especially if the rate is irregularly irregular, that's something that we are going to treat with this protocol. And you're also looking for verbal cues. So patients saying like, I don't feel like myself anymore. I don't really know why I do the things that I do. Sometimes I just feel so lost. Sometimes I don't know what's going on anymore. There's statements patients can make that give you an indication that they're having some sort of a cognitive dissonance and an inability to understand what's going on. This light in the Shen's thing, the Shen in the eyes, is worth spending a second on. So we're often looking for the state of the person's spirit through their eyes. This is one of the ways in which you can do things like facial rejuvenation treatments on patients. One of the ways facial rejuvenation is done is by getting rid of wrinkles, by using things like intradermal needles, using like very gentle cupping to kind of puff up in a nice way the face. One of the other ways is to make the person's eyes more brilliant, which tends to make them more attractive, not necessarily in a romantic way, but as in like a leadership way, in a trustworthy way. So deep level treatments where the person falls asleep, has strange dreams, has an out-of-body experience, which is decently common with good acupuncture. Often they'll come out of this and their eyes will look quite different. Yeah. And often people who have this sort of possession, have this sort of invasion, will avoid eye contact. There's a certain not wanting to be seen that comes with this sort of invasion of a Gui. Often after the treatments, they're comfortable being seen. I had a patient 2 summers ago when I was working in Cyprus who had, I won't go into details about it, she was 25, yeah, and had gone through a lot of abuse during her teenage years, had a stutter, and had a lot of difficulty making eye contact. It took 2 of these treatments for the stutter to go away permanently and her to have no trouble making eye contact again, just because this is something she picked up. When we're looking at the herbal side of, where we're going to go over an acupuncture protocol here in just a second, but we're looking for things that do things like unblock the orifice and brighten the eyes. When you see the phrase brighten the eyes, oftentimes that means clinically at Pacific College within TCM that it's used for people who have trouble seeing, and it's used for people who have vision problems. On a more esoteric or classical level, it means that we're helping to bring the person's spirit up to their eyes, that brightness is coming from inside. So a lot of the points, like Sun Semiao's ghost points, a lot of them involve the word Ming. Brightening the eyes is in that. And what I'm going to be showing you guys here are the Worsley 5-element school internal and external dragon treatments, which is what Bonnie Jarrett recommends. Before we get into the actual treatment aspect, I just want to talk about this from a Western medicine perspective really quick. When people go through experiences within a Western psychology framework, in which they get completely overwhelmed and they develop new ways of behaving, we call those coping mechanisms, right? So if someone's in a situation where someone's telling them, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to do something worse to you. The person may adapt behaviors, may adapt patterns that keep them safe in the moment. There's nothing pathological about that. Well, it's not good for them, but that may be correct. The issue is, once they leave the situation, do they keep doing those coping mechanisms? Do they continue to utilize behaviors that were necessary in a short-term manner for survival, real or imagined, for survival? Do they continue to exhibit those afterwards? If they do, often we want to go in and help them let go of that pattern. That is the Chinese medicine. In Chinese medicine, we would see that coping pattern as a possession. within Western psychology would see it as a coping mechanism that no longer serves them. The treatments are really simple. This is a needle technique. So the internal dragons, it's a point on the Ren channel between Ren 14 and 15, stomach 25, stomach 32, and stomach 41. We use the internal dragons if the person produced this themselves. That doesn't mean that often there's a person on the outside or a situation on the outside. It could be a car accident. I had a patient who developed this sort of a thing from seeing someone get hit by a train, for example. There are lots of different ways that this traumatic sort of event can happen, but ultimately it's their reaction to something that happened on the outside or on the inside that caused this possession, and this is the treatment that we use. And on the other hand, we have external dragon treatments for people who've been affected by their environment. Often this is some sort of toxicity or poisoning. I have a friend who I've been trying to, hopefully I'll get to try this on in the next couple of weeks, who worked at the Whitney as an art restoration expert and got heavy metal poisoning from working on paintings there, and has exhibited some personality changes since then that she's aware of, that she's uncomfortable with. So I want to try this on her. I had good success working with this on people who worked in auto shops and painting in Central America, where there was often no ventilation, and their literal job would poison them. This combination is used to clear that out. And the only other thing you need to know is the needle technique. For each of these, you go, it's bilateral. The needles are put in perpendicularly, straight in, top to bottom, right to left, dispersing. And the patient has to feel every needle. You have to get the chi on the needles. That's always true, but extra true here. Excuse me. And what you do is you come back and you check on the patient every 15, 20 minutes or so, and you're just checking their pulse. You don't have to talk to them. And you do this until the pulse changes. I've got about an 80% success rate with getting rid of irregularly irregular pulses in one treatment using this. It's really effective. It's cool. If the problem is coming from a heart pathology, like heart blood stagnation causing an irregularly irregular pulse, it won't work. But if it's due to this possession, it will. And then the
question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So you mentioned that you check on them every 15, 20 minutes. How long is a entire treatment since you put in the needle until you take it out? I mean, how many times do you actually check? Just once?
With normally in normal practice for me, I usually have 30-ish minutes of needle retention. With this particular treatment, usually this is something I'm going to discuss with the patient beforehand. Afterwards, they may notice some personality changes as well. This can have a fairly strong effect. So this is usually something where they come in and they're on the table in 5 minutes. So we have up to almost an hour if we want it.
So you get to check 2-3 times in between.
Or in 15 minutes, their pulse is normal and they're done. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a fairly straightforward treatment. It's easy to do. There's recommended ritual that goes along with this, like lighting a candle in the room, setting intention about making sure that any energy that leaves that patient is cleared out. I do those things. I find ritual helpful. There are plenty of people who have a more materialistic view who use these treatments and say, all that stuff's hooey and unimportant. You can, your mileage may vary here. But this is an effective way of rapidly helping people get over trauma that they've experienced if they're still carrying it with them. And it's not something that is particularly TCM related, so you're not going to learn it in general in school. You'll hear about it, but you're not going to learn it a lot, and it's not on boards or comps. But it makes a big clinical difference. So I'd recommend taking note of these treatments. Generally, the next week you do an aggressive energy treatment, which is, does the treatment have to be repeated? It shouldn't have to be repeated. If they are still in a traumatic situation, then you may have to repeat the treatment. So I'd say 9 out of 10 times they still have a normal pulse when they come back the next week. And that's your main barometer. Do they have light in their eyes? Is their pulse back to normal? The idea is that if you're trying to, like, let's say they're coming in because they have insomnia, and they have insomnia due to liver yin deficiency. As you're trying to tonify the liver, if you don't clear this sort of stuff out, it generally doesn't get better. So you clear this first, and then you can work on the other things. Does TCM have a protocol for trauma? Physical trauma, sure. Psychological, emotional trauma, not so much TCM related. There are things that are done, but there's not a whole lot of, within TCM psychology is fairly limited. There just isn't a ton of it. There are things, but most of it is Chinese medicine outside of that. Not as nice. I would recommend, I don't want to tell you guys about herbal stuff too much. There are herbal formulas that are used. So like I had a friend, I was over at her house cooking dinner together 7 years ago. And I'd given her acupuncture earlier. She was an acupuncture student as well. And she was in AA. She was a sponsor in AA. And she got a call while I was there that her sponsee had hung herself. So I had an acupuncture kit with me, and I gave her some, this is safe enough. I gave her the red pill out of a Untitled kit, which is, Untitled is an herbal formula to stop bleeding more than anything else, but significant enough emotional trauma is basically bleeding as well. So gave her this formula to stop bleeding. She took it and about an hour later fell asleep and slept through the night. I left and slept through the night and talked to her the next day. She's like, I'm completely destroyed and broken up about this, but I feel like I can get up and do things about this and help organize her funeral and help deal with everything that comes next. I'm out of, like, within a 14-hour period, I got out of the acute trauma stage, and now I'm just in the this is a terrible situation phase. There wasn't a dulling of emotions, plenty of crying, emotional expression over the next handful of days, but stopped the bleeding quickly. So I'd say that's one of the best things to do for situations with psychological or emotional trauma. Untitled can be dangerous if people have heart conditions, if they have bleeding conditions, if they've got blood conditions. So don't start giving these things to people right away. But once you're an intern in the clinic, you should have the knowledge base to know when it's okay and when not okay to do this. Chinese medicine has a lot of answers for psycho-emotional trauma. TCM is limited. So the red pill is the emergency pill in Untitled. Usually it comes in a like aluminum blister pack, and it looks like there's, I think, 10 pills in it, but then there's a tiny circle. There's nothing on any of the labeling about there being another pill. If you pop out that little circle, there's a tiny red pill that you take in case of severe trauma. So that's what we use there. And the idea here is that the trauma caused enough damage to her energetic body. The shock of this was causing her to scatter, and this brought her back together. Sanqi is an ingredient in Untitled, yes. We don't know the exact ingredients in Untitled, but Hunan province, where it comes from, is known for its Sanqi production, and that's a stop bleeding herb, so probably mostly Sanqi. And Sanqi is almost impossible to work with in its raw or dried form, because it's like, I cracked a brass mortar and pestle trying to break Sanqi once. So yeah, it's not friendly. So it's almost impossible to work with. So having it pre-processed into a pill form is nice, and Untitled has a good record. Okay, that possession stuff makes some sense to people. This is like rapid brief overview of it. I just want to introduce you guys to some ideas that are outside of TCM and hopefully share some stuff that's interesting that isn't, you know, direct testing.
Peter, are those slides on the Moodle for the possession?
I just tossed them up in the chat. so you can download them here. But yeah, I'll be putting everything I just put in the chat onto the Moodle as well. So just.
Thank you.
All right, I got a copy of that, yeah. Okay, I just got a private message. I assume if people have private messages, they're okay with me sharing the information, just not their names. So could someone, unless it is clearly personal, could someone who's becoming dysregulated take the red pill if they're enduring PTSD episodes? I have gotten into debates about this. So when I was in Guatemala and treating patients, there's no child protective services. There's no services to help people. In the US, if you have a patient who comes in who, if a child comes to see you and it's clear that they're enduring some sort of abuse, you can do things to make that situation better. There are people you can call. There's ways you can involve other organizations. That was not true in the area I was working in Guatemala. And there were multiple occasions where I treated teenagers, wives, on a couple occasions, husbands, who were being abused by partners. And the reality of the situation was if they left, they would probably either starve to death or go into some form of worse situation. There were not options. So the question was, if someone is being consistently re-abused and that's not going to stop, do you want to depossess them or not? I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. That's a personal choice that thankfully you guys don't have to make for quite a while, because you guys are in early stages of learning this. But there are questions about, like, you know, if parts of the person are dissociated, do you want to bring them back to the experience of the reality that they're in? I don't know. It depends. It depends too much on you and on them. Lonnie Jarrett said, every time you see this, you should get rid of it always, no matter what. There are definitely some people that I've worked with where I'm like, I'm not sure that that's the compassionate thing to do. And I think his argument would be, it's not about compassion, it's about consciousness, and consciousness is always better. I don't know about that. If someone has PTSD, you probably aren't giving them any Yunin Biao, but I would definitely consider doing those depossession protocols. Yeah. Yunin Biao is often given in a low dose as a supplement to those, just to help the person smoothly go through that transition. Yunin Biao doesn't have a sedative effect or a euphoric effect or a deadening of the emotions effect. It doesn't do any of that. But if a person's having extreme emotions that involve this kind of energetic bleeding, then it will stop those. So oftentimes I give small doses of Yunin Biao along with one of a number of other formulas to help people who are processing PTSD. But it's not enough on its own. Okay, next week we're going to go over, I'm not quite sure yet. I'll have something posted today, tomorrow, up with a plan, and send out an email to all you guys talking about it. I just wrapped up my semester of the doctoral program, so now that I've written 35 pages of essays and papers in the past week, I've got more time. So let's see. So I'll send out an email to you guys tomorrow, and we'll figure out what we're talking about next week. You've basically learned everything you're going to be tested on for the final exam. I want you to go over all 12 of these organs. I want you to know the statements of fact up and down and back and forth. And I want you, if I give you the majority of the symptoms, to be able to tell me what pattern is being shown. I'm not going to be tricky with you guys. I'm telling you that we're 2 weeks out from the final, but I'm telling you now because you should probably start studying now, because you want this in long-term memory, not short-term. I will send out a study guide next week once I manage to get a final exam actually up onto the internet, and I know what's on it, because I've got to rewrite a bit of it. I will get a study guide out to you by next week. Let's say that instead. Just taking notes for myself. So, but I mean, I'm telling you right now, I want you to know basically everything from the 12 organ slides from the past few weeks. And then there's going to be a bit of stuff, there's going to be a decent amount from the first half of the semester, just review of the same things that were on the midterm, because you're going to be tested on all this stuff 10 more times before you graduate. This has to be long-term storage, so we're going to keep going over it. I think that's about it. Will you be able to post the lectures? Which lectures are you talking about, Sunmi?
Are the recordings from the last couple of classes?
Yes, I was working on that this morning. Those will be up today or tomorrow. I will completely up to date by then. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll hang out for another 10 minutes. If people have questions, I'm here. Otherwise, you are all free to go. Thank you for coming today. I hope that was interesting. Hope that was useful.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
I have a question for you, Peter. Since we just talked about possession, and the possession segment is not going to be on the final, right?
You're not going to be examined on that in any way, shape, or form by me.
Okay, so you said TCM doesn't have a whole lot to offer when it comes to mental disorders.
That's a little flippant of me, but yeah.
Limited?
I think it's limited, but yeah.
Okay, so, but there's also a saying that in Chinese medicine, the mental and the physical are not separated, or they're sort of, we don't separate the mental from the physical.
Right.
Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, because
sure,
of what you covered earlier? And
well, so the way that I think about this is that mental and physical are just different types of symptoms. They arise from the same patterns. There's nothing special about mental and emotional. But there are things that manifest more physically or more mentally or more emotionally, often depending on the person. So like if I cut my hand cooking, that's physical. If I cut my hand cooking and I get furious about it, and then I yell at my partner when they come home, then that's more emotional in my perspective of it, right? If I wake up hungover and it manifests digestively, that's different than if I wake up hungover and it manifests with anger as well. So while mental and emotional issues and functioning aren't special, they're also not exactly the same as physical. There's always a connection. Like anyone who's spent a bit of time meditating will know that like when you cut your hand cooking, there's an emotional reaction there. It just might be small enough that it doesn't really matter that much. But there are a bunch of things that, I'll answer that in a second, Jonathan. There are also things that seem to almost exclusively manifest mentally, psychologically, and then a little bit physically. So, for example, if you see someone get hit by a car, that might manifest physically in insomnia, you might get tremors, but the places where that's lodged in the body are more related to the person's, to what I would say is a deeper level of their functioning. That's going to be more related to the spirits in the person's system. So we can treat that as blood stagnation and wind, but we also want to start thinking about like, what is it about, 10 people saw this person get hit by a car. Why is one person having panic attacks a month later and the other 9 are fine? There are different ways in which you can be vulnerable. We have to start looking at what a person believes about how the world works. We have to start looking at other layers of a person's makeup that are deeper, that are more at the level of the extraordinary organs and the extraordinary meridians. And TCM doesn't, I would say that the TCM perspective on psychology it's not bad, it's just somewhat superficial, because I mean, this is a little bit controversial, but I don't really know how to talk about this medicine without being honest about it. There are aspects of people's psyche that the CCP doesn't want to talk about. And so they don't have a medicine which they've excised that from the medicine.
So that's interesting, because it sort of works with what you were talking about in the lecture, right? I mean, so easier for some psychological symptoms, you can find a physical pattern to treat, correct? In Chinese medicine.
Yes.
Let's not talk about TCM, but we'll just talk about Chinese medicine.
Yes.
But some of them, you cannot find a physical pattern to find the roots to. Is that what you're saying?
Well, my experience is that there's usually a physical pattern. There's usually a pattern in the same sense, like blood stagnation, heart fire, stomach deficiency. There's usually some pattern you can work with, but often with mental and emotional issues, it's hard to get traction on it with that pattern. So like you're working on it and they're getting very slow and gradual improvement, but they keep coming to you and saying similar phrases like that are reflecting maybe a 5-element imbalance, maybe something like, I just don't understand how something like this could happen. I just don't understand it. And the Japanese, Henry McCann teaches about this occasionally. The Japanese have a system that involves something that kind of resembles talk therapy. The Chinese used to have a system that involved the telling of stories in northern China to treat disorders using 5-element principles. And I've found that very often, if I'm working with people who have a mental, emotional thing that's causing them distress that is manifesting mostly at the level of they just can't get past it mentally. So this might be someone, for instance, who like, life is going fine, and then their fiance leaves them out of nowhere and gives them no explanation and they can't get over it. It's like, okay, well, what is that? Well, there's a metal aspect about letting go, but there's also gonna be something about their perception of themselves that's gonna be in there. Because now, like if before this, they were the person that everyone desired, now that's broken and we gotta figure out, like, so that's an earth aspect that we gotta put back together. And maybe there's some water pieces here around fear of belonging. And you have to look at it from a bunch of different perspectives. And there are aspects of that within the philosophy of the Communist Party of China, you are told what the correct perspective is, and that's not really up for questioning. And I'm not making a statement about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it does limit what can be done when treating people who have issues around those things. And I often find that I'm using points that are related to treating the spirit, and I'm not doing talk therapy with the person, but there is an aspect of talking being important, of helping them to break out of whatever, like if they're stuck in a loop, we got to find some way to get them to change to something else in their conversation. And then through the acupuncture, they tend to get resolution on their own. And that's not treating heart fire. That's often treating according to acupuncture point names and following other people who've done that sort of work.
So in our curriculum, there will always be some inclusion of the 5-element theories and protocols, because emotional, psychological symptoms are very prevalent these days, and
yes.
It's a big part of being not well in our society. Anyway.
I think so. Give me just 1 second and I'll answer that. Jonathan, turbid urine means that something has gone wrong in the qi transformation in the urinary bladder. It usually means there's dampness. Sometimes it means, and by turbid in this case, we mean like literally not very clear to see through, like slightly milky. It usually means there's some degree of dampness, or it means that the person's leaking their essence. So with men, that would be spermatorrhea. And with women, it could be some sort of, and with either gender, it could be some sort of urinary disease as well, some sort of pus that's leaking into the urine.
And so if the urine is not really white, just not clear.
Yeah, just not clear. Just not clear. It can be yellow and dark because of that, but in this case, there's a cloudy aspect, a milkiness to it. Yeah. Yeah, and heat will generally not do that. Heat will make urine darker, and maybe blood will begin to come into it if it's bad enough.
I see. So anything with turbidity or not clear has got to do with phlegm. With
yes.
phlegm. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So Leon, yeah, I mean, I think TCM, Chinese medicine approaches to treating mental and emotional disorders are very important, which is why I'm including some of it here. But, you know, it's one of the nice things about Pacific College. They give us a bit of leeway to talk about what we're passionate about in these classes and to share things, so that there's a strict curriculum with room for branching. And when it comes to the clinic, there's people from all over in the clinic in terms of their experience, and they're going to bring their own approach. You're going to see me do basically no TCM in the clinic, like a little bit, but I've picked up stuff from all over the place. We might fall back to TCM in the clinic if it's something I don't really know. There are plenty of elderly patients where, like, really we're doing palliative care. You know, we're trying to improve the quality of their life. But the 80-year-old with low back pain, the goal isn't really to get rid of the low back pain. The goal is to make them as functional as possible and as happy as possible and reduce the low back pain. And for those people, TCM is often fine. But when you're talking about, you know, a 20-year-old who has no idea what they want to do in the world and has been abused, like, we got to go to places that that TCM doesn't go, in my experience. Your mic is off. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. So in the clinic, there will be a lot of teaching going on. Practical.
You should get most of your education in the clinic.
Oh.
Like, all the rest of this is the framework.
Yeah.
But the clinic is where it actually happens.
Yes.
So we talk about patients in theory here, and you need this language so that if I, as a supervisor, says the issue with this patient is that they've lost their connection to heaven, and so we're going to be using points to reestablish that, because this patient's depression looks like heart Q deficiency, but really underlying that, they've lost aspects of their Shen because they don't know what their purpose in life is.
Right.
And so their depression isn't, you know, it's not that they don't have enough B12. It's not that their heart Q is deficient. It's that they don't know why they're here in the first place. They're disconnected from purpose as a concept, and therefore they're suffering. So, like, there's some Buddhist aspects that come in. There's some Taoist aspects. I reference Nietzsche moderately frequently. Like, you pull from wherever you can.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. He who has a why can bear any how. There's plenty of patients who are suffering not because there's something wrong with their physical form, but because they don't know why they're here. You know, I feel a lot different if I'm sore after a day of good, hard, important work where I know I help people than if I'm sore because I lay in bed all day and did nothing and was lazy. You know, there are some patients that come in who are suffering because they don't know why they get up in the morning, but they tell you it's back pain.
Yeah.
And TCM doesn't have a lot to offer there.
Yeah.
But Chinese medicine does. Chinese medicine is fun to offer.
So I guess what you're saying is that aside from, you know, learning in clinic, this is always an ongoing learning while you practice constantly. You're branching out to all kinds of theories and all that, right?
That's what makes it fun. You get to learn for the rest of your life. And I think it's also, this is a field where, you know, we have a problem within Western medicine that most of the doctors who are 55, a lot of what they do is outdated.
Yeah.
Like, but there's good studies that say if you want a good doctor, find someone who's under 35. Like, that's where you're going to find a lot of your best doctors. Surgeons, it's a little bit different, but like newest, sharpest technique, that's often what you want. One of the nice things in Chinese medicine is that the personal experience is extremely important. The patients you see, the ways in which you learn how to talk about and theorize and formulate the ways in which you've worked with people, that matters. So you can still be practicing at 65, at 70, if you want to be. And what you have to share only gets more valuable with time if you're practicing. That's right. That's right. Yes. Well, thank you for talking to me about this. I appreciate it. And more study for the quiz. Okay, thanks. Have a good week. You too. Okay. Bye.